Hello again, friends. And you are my friends, and welcome back to another edition of the 605 Superpodcast. This being another of our special editions, this being a look at the life and career of Pat Patterson, a Hall of Fame wrestler, a Hall of Fame creative executive in the wrestling business, and someone who so many people have fond memories of. We're going to talk a lot about that here on this special episode of the Superpodcast. And to join me here at the top of the show and at various points throughout the show, I'm very happy to have back on the show the man who, along with Pat, wrote Accepted, How the First Gay Superstar Changed WWE. He's our friend Bertrand Hebert. Bertrand, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation, Brian. I mean, it's been bittersweet, but, I owe Pat at least to make sure that his story is told one more time.
Well, we really appreciate you being here, and of course, our condolences to you because we know how close you were with Pat and the relationship you formed with Pat while working on Accepted, and of course, your relationship went well beyond the publication of the book. Before we talk about Pat and his career, talk a little bit about the Pat Patterson you got to know. To anyone who just watched him on TV, or anyone who just heard stories about him, what was Pat Patterson really like?
Pat was always trying to entertain himself and entertain people around him. He wanted to laugh, and he wanted to have good food and good drinks and enjoy life, be happy. And I mean, that's the message. I mean, he was never consumed by wrestling. It was always about having fun. And, he was like, wrestling. You want to talk about wrestling all the time. I'm talking to Pat Patterson. So the first few times I'm like, we're talking about his life, but we're talking about Raw the night before too. And it's stop. Okay, that's enough. Let's talk about something else. But he was really good about that. And that's a great lesson I'm taking out of it, is that wrestling is not the end of everything. You have to be grounded in reality, and you have to pick your battle. And sometimes, wrestling is wrestling. It's cool. It's fun. We love it, but don't let it consume your life.
How did the book project first take light, and when did you actually first get to know Pat and talk to Pat?
So Sylvain Grenier was with La Résistance, was a friend that Pat made, and he got into the wrestling business. And when he left WWE, he ran a promotion here in Montreal, and they came up with a project, 4 hours, a pilot of 4 shows, 4 hours, and I wrote, produced, scripted, booked the show for them. And since Pat was so close to Sylvain, we ended up having a production meeting with Pat Patterson to go over our shows. So that's how I first met him. And I brought him a copy of Mad Dog's Midgets and Screwjob about the history of Montreal wrestling. So we went through that meeting. It was just amazing. I mean, as someone involved in wrestling, to actually talk shop with Pat Patterson is all in itself very, it's a surreal experience a little bit. So, he also asked permission to Vince to be part of the show. So we ended up reviving the segment he used to do on French television called Le Brunch with Pat Patterson, which was kind of a Piper's Pit in French with Pat. So I ended up on the day of the shoot producing and then writing and coming up with ideas for Pat to do for his segment. So that also was quite special. I don't want to sound like a mark, but, I kind of was. And, we talked that day a lot because, we're producing. So obviously, it's time, camera shoot and director and all of that stuff. So we have some time to talk. And he's like, I really like the book. I like what you wrote about me. The Office, they want me to write a book, and they keep getting me those writers, and you can't talk to them. They don't know anything. I have to explain everything to them, So we talk, and I can talk with Pat about Silvio Sanson, the first promoter he had in Montreal. And I know who the hell Dolph Ziggler was. So he could talk to me about anything and everything, switch between English and French, which also is a talent, and tell me his story without having to explain everything. So he really loved that because he could just tell the stories without having to tell me who was who in the story. That stayed there, but a few weeks later, he came back and called and said, well, Hebert, I want you to do the book. So I'm gonna give your name. They're gonna call you and they're gonna get you to the office. Okay. You believe him because so far, he's been awesome, but yeah, they're gonna fly me to the office. They flew me to Stamford to interview with Kevin Dunn about the book. So that was pleasant meeting. But obviously I wasn't their first choice, as they thought Pat had picked a wrestling guy and they were afraid, and I only had one book under my belt at that point. They were afraid that, I was going to be a book just about wrestling. But the thing is I knew about the wrestling, so I could get to the rest of the story. I think in our Mad Dog Vachon book and in the Andre the Giant book, we always went in who was the person behind the wrestling. That's the part that put everything together, and that's where I wanted to go with Pat, and that's how Pat was presenting in the book to me. Was always, I want to tell about my life. I want to talk about Louis. I want to talk about the travel, the territories, but it was never about, matches after matches or how big of a crowd it was. It was about that one time when he was scared, or that one time where Ray Stevens brought him to a girls. But it was never about, I won 25 championship. So I knew right from the get-go we were not going to get there. But in the case of the WWE, I think they were a little bit scared that it was going to be a quote unquote wrestling book. So they tell me they're going to meet with a few more people, and which I interpreted as we're going to try to push other writer on Pat, and we need to make a decision on this next week. Titan's time being what it is, 7 months later, Pat calls me and said, "What's up with the book? What's going on? It's been a while." And I was like, "I don't know." Nobody has said anything. He said, "Wait a minute." So he calls at 1 day later or 2 days later, and he's like, "Okay, they're gonna call you for one more interview." So I did one more phone interview, and Pat called me like the day after or something like that, and he's like, "Okay, they're gonna call you tomorrow to tell you have it, and we're gonna start." Okay, so I don't know what happened there exactly. I never, but obviously Pat was like, "Okay, I get you to fire the other two writer. This guy is my guy," and I think they kind of put it on the line with him is like, okay, well, if he's your guy, then you're going to have to deliver a book. So, and we went and, we worked nonstop for about 6 months. So I did that for about 6 months, only that, which was amazing in itself to be able to get paid to do what I love and talk about what I love. And we had over 15 to 20 working sessions of interviews. And then in between, I would work nonstop in putting together the puzzle that he was giving me, because he was basically giving me a big, huge puzzle of a bunch of stories, not in order. So I had to figure out what are we going to keep and how are we going to put that together into a book. And I remember one night, I'm bringing him like a very rough draft of sections of stuff that we discussed. So it's not even a book. It's not even a chapter. It's basically, a transcript of some working session with him. So it's like I'm trying to bring it as close as possible as it would sound on paper, but there's everything all jumbled up together. It's not even a chapter. And we're trying to go through that. And he's like, I don't know if it's the part about reading about yourself that he didn't like at first, but he was, and there was some stuff obviously that we're not going to make the book, but he wanted to see some stuff. And I just brought him whatever I got. So it didn't went smoothly that night. So by the time I was back home, I had a message on my voicemail, and he was like, "My God, I just read everything. It was so good. I loved it. We're going to make that fucking book." Okay. So I was like, okay. After that point, he started to call me his friend, and, now he believed that I could actually put the story on paper. I think that was the basic of it. And after that, it went pretty smoothly up until the last revision where he wanted me to delete everything. So that was a scary day where I had to tell him, okay, I know what you don't want. I know what needs to be there. And I'm going to finish the last reading alone because, I cannot deliver one page as a book. because I think it was like he was like scared because it was becoming real. It's like, oh, I'm not sure it should be there. I'm not sure it should be there. Well, I cannot delete the whole book. So that was the scary day. But after he got the final book and people started to read it and tell him about it, I mean, there was this guy at the airport who turned to him and took the book out of his bag for him to sign and tell him how much he loved the book and that the man in question was gay and that how much Pat inspired him. And in the last few years when we did convention, there was always that one person that would come to him and tell him how much they were inspired by him to come out. And that really was, that left a big impression on him. There was that couple that got married that came to one of the show in England, and they basically interrupted their honeymoon to come back and attend the show for Pat, and he just loved it that they had this married couple, two men there to see him. I mean, he had them sit in first row of the show. So he was amazed about the power the book had, and and I'm not sure he even realized how much of a testament it's going to become of his life, because that's pure Pat. The biggest compliment I was given was Mick Foley, who told us that he was reading the book and he could hear Pat speak in his head. That, people who know Pat felt like Pat was actually speaking. And that's the feeling I was going for, is that I want you to be sitting at the bar with Pat with a beer or vodka, whatever is your favorite. And he's just like telling you stories like he does all the time. So it was a great experience, and he loved it so much that he wanted to promote it. Oh, we got to go and promote it. So then we started doing the convention. We did the Jericho Cruise, and we did the big event. We went back to Minnesota. We had in the car for that trip, a few hours trip between Minneapolis and the casino where we were having the shows. There was like Pat Patterson sitting in the front, Bruce Pritchard and Dutch Mantel, me, and Eric Bischoff on the back seat. So, that, you cannot buy those experiences. That was just amazing time. And, since I was with Pat and, they call me the Pat rider, that Pat couldn't go anywhere without a rider anymore. So that was just fun. And, I took care of him, because at that point, there was some dementia and some Alzheimer going on. And that's one thing I would love for people to remember. If you met Pat in the past few years at convention and you were in the business and you felt Pat, didn't recognize you or was big leaguing you or something of that nature, that wasn't the case. Pat just simply didn't remember, didn't register for whatever reason. And, it was never a case of him being too good for anybody. It was just simply his memory playing trick on him.
Well, Bertrand, let's go back to the beginning. What can you tell the listeners about Pat's early days, Pat's childhood, and also, of course, how Pat broke into the wrestling business?
Well, Pat wanted to perform. That's what he was addicted to. He became an altar boy at church, the pageantry of the dressing up and being in front of a crowd. He loved that. He thought about joining the circus and become a trapeze artist. He was ice skating, but he wasn't playing hockey. He wanted to join the Ice Capades, which he had even a tryout to join the troupe. But at some point, they were not very rich, and it's before television. So they buy bread, and in the bread there is a ticket to go see wrestling, a free tickets that you could get with the bread. And that's how he discovers wrestling. And he's like, let's use a Pat. He went banana for the wrestling. And it was what he wanted to do. And he became a hot dog vendor at wrestling shows. He would jump the gate to see wrestling because he couldn't afford a ticket. Anything to see more wrestling. He loved Killer Kowalski. He loved Buddy Rogers. He loved how Kowalski was a mean guy, that you hated. And he loved how Buddy Rogers had the jackets and the flamboyance and all of that. So that That was his inspiration as a fan, and he got to be friend with a guy at school who was the son of Silvio Sanson, who was one of the many wrestling promoter in Montreal, and he got the son to train with him, Cyclone, and what was the nickname of the. And they put together a pretty good match in training at the Loisir, which was a kind of a it would be like a youth house of some sort where people would do different activities, and they had wrestling there, and that's how he learned, and with the ultimate goal being to convince Silvio Sanson that they should put him and his son on in the ring. And obviously, Silvio Sanson being a promoter, well, that wasn't his idea to have his son becoming a wrestler. But, Pat convinced him, and they were tearing it down. And right off the bat, Pat was a very good worker and a natural worker. It took a lot of bumps, so like you said, the old timer, they all wanted to stretch you. But as soon as they realize that you can make them look good, they'll want to work with you. And that's basically what happened. So, it was local wrestling. There was basically no money, bounce check, and, ate in a car and things of that nature. But he learned, and, no 9-to-5 job was good for Pat. So obviously, it led to him meeting Tony Santos, who came to Montreal, and deciding after the big blow off with his dad about him being gay to borrow $20 from his sister, take a suitcase in the garbage, and move to the U.S. and take the Greyhound to Boston. And that's where he started wrestling for Tony Santos.
And it was during that period of time, 1961 in Boston, where Pat Patterson would meet a young Les Thatcher. Let's now go to a conversation I was able to have earlier today with Les Thatcher, talking about his memories of working in Boston for Tony Santos alongside Pat Patterson. I am happy to welcome back to the Super Podcast today to talk about Pat Patterson, someone who knew him at the very beginning of his wrestling exploits in the United States, a friend of the show, Les Thatcher. Les, thanks for being here today.
It's a bittersweet pleasure, Brian. Yeah, Pat and I go all the way back to 1961.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Pat in 61, because it wasn't just you and Pat going back to 61. That was the beginning of Pat's wrestling career in the United States. He came from Montreal. How was his English? Talk about when you first met him, and how was his English when you first met him?
The English was, he had that Montreal inflections, or you knew he was from Montreal, but he spoke good English, And, he was a big fan of Killer Kowalski. And so his ring gear was purple trunks, purple boots, and what I call a shorty robe, like, more the length of a sport coat, right? But a robe, and nonetheless in a tie. It was also purple, and that was, because he was such a big Kowalski fan. But, that was, and of course, Pat had just, you're right, it was his first venture into the States to work. And when I first worked with him, actually, there's a poster behind my computer on the wall here from August the 8th, 1961, at the Mountain Park Pavilion in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And the second match on that card was Pat Patterson versus Les Milady, later to be Les Thatcher. And so that's how far back we go, And but you know what? We're both still, he'd been working a couple years already, but I remember he was so smooth, he was, talk about it, guys being a natural, and I assume that, is the best way to say it. He was just a natural, but we had a lot of fun too. And, actually, I knew we were going to do this, and I posted some stuff on Facebook of my remembrances of Pat as well. But we worked in this town called North Adams, Massachusetts, in an outdoor stadium. And this town is where some of the top boxers, fighters that were going to fight, in the Garden in New York, would come to train, like Sugar Ray Robinson, Paul Pender, and guys like that. And there was this permanent ring in the middle of this stadium. And of course, back then, they would charge people to come in and watch these big celebrity boxers spar and train. So Tony Santos had booked a match there, and Pat and I were against one another on the card. And the only problem with this is boxers don't take bumps. And this ring was built out of railroad ties and concrete block. So it was basically like walking on your asphalt driveway or your concrete basement floor. So Pat and I each took one bump and decided maybe a stand-up match would be more beneficial.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. And then another, again, everybody's, I think, talked about Pat being a prankster and having a great sense of humor. And that was evident then as well. We worked at another outdoor show, this in Hyannis, Massachusetts. And the show was promoted by an old ex-wrestler, Fred Bruno, who refereed for Tony Santos. And Fred had his ears are the most cauliflowered ears I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, both ears had maybe the size of a pinhole that you could actually, you could put something in. I mean, they were just that cauliflowered. But anyway, Cowboy Ronnie Hill had named the arena in Hyannis Bruno's backyard because it actually was Fred's backyard to a certain. He owned a lot of property off the back of where his home was, and in the summer he ran wrestling shows here. But anyway, it had rained earlier in the day, and there were a few low spots in that ring where there was actually water standing in the canvas. Apparently, the canvas stayed on the ring 24/7. So anyway, Pat's whole offense that night was to be sure that he could get me down near one of those puddles of water and cover me, so the referee would have to slide in to count. And so Pat, in his, in true heel manner, could bounce up and slap those puddles. You're not counting fast enough. And as he's slapping those puddles, he spraying a referee in the face with that water. So by the end of the match, I think he had more heat with the referee than he had with any of the fans watching the damn show.
How was he as a heel in those early days?
Oh, he was good. He was good as a heel. But you know what? And of course, that was something that I remember. He came by HWA when I had the contract with WWE, and actually, I've got a picture of he and I both flanking this poster I mentioned somewhere. Us pointing to our names. But he was just a talented guy who loved life. He was a free spirit. Well, he met Louis, his life partner, in Boston. And actually, they attended, along with some of the other wrestlers. I got married the first time in November of 61, from a lady from Winthrop, Massachusetts. And they were at my wedding. I also remember Louis had bought Pat a damn German Shepherd. Now, realize this rooming house we lived in, there were some small apartments, but at this time when Louis bought him the dog, Pat had a room. Hell, I couldn't tell you what the measurement was, but it had a bed, a chair, a lamp, a sink where you could wash your hands, and then everybody in that section of the rooming house used a community bathroom. When there was one in each hallway on all 4 floors, and so you figure him living in this room with a German Shepherd didn't last very long because the landlord, trying to get the dog in and out, without the landlord seeing him. So Louis had to take the dog back. But, wow.
Talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about the rooming house on Westland Avenue. Who else was living there, and what was the community of wrestlers in that building like?
It was kind of crazy. Everybody was young. I was 19, 20 years old. I was 61, right? Is when we were there. Kid from Cleveland, Jimmy Flash Thomas lived there. Ronnie Dupree, Terry Garvin, Don Kindred, Black Magic lived there. Haystacks Muldoon, Alex Medina. So a bunch of the guys were there. And so, everybody would congregate in different places. I had mentioned to you before we started recording about Boston stew, and I made a list of all the ingredients years and years ago, and of course it's disappeared someplace. But anyway, there were 4 floors, and at the end of the long hallway on each floor, there was a 1-bedroom apartment, a little kitchen, living room, and a bedroom. But that person still had to share a bath as well. But so Goldie, Ronnie Dupree, had one. It was the 2nd floor. And so first one came available on the 4th floor, and Pat jumped on it because he couldn't be outdone by Goldie. So anyway, I don't even know how this whole thing started, but they decided we were going to do something. Mr. Aston that owned the place, if you were casting a movie about a landlord of a rooming house, Mr. Aston and his dog Jippy would have worked out really well. I mean, they fit the whole thing. So anyway, they were always trying to rib Mr. Aston, and so it all started. Somebody said, "We'll cook this up and cook." Anyway, somebody got one of these big galvanized tubs, like a 5-gallon or whatever. And Pat had a stove in his 4th floor little apartment. So anyway, they just started putting stuff in this. This was in the middle of the day. And so a whole box of oatmeal, right? Not the little packets, but a whole damn box of oatmeal. Feathers from a pillow. Apple peels, orange peels. Terry, you got a garbage in your room you don't need. And so they're filling this whole tub up on top of Pat's stove. And so he sets it to simmer, right? And at this point, Tony's office used to be right across the street on the 2nd floor of this industrial building in the middle of a parking lot, right across from the rooming house where we lived. But he had, in late 60 or early 61, I guess it was, he moved up to St. Bethal Street and the old Boston Arena, so he could run shows there and had his office and the gym there as well. So anyway, we had to go down. Something was going on at the arena, so we're going down there. So we come back, and everybody's gathered at Pat's place, and this whole thing is it's mixing water, but it's kind of boiled down, and now it's almost like a paste, but it's huge, right? And it's so about the owner, Mr. Aston, lived on the 1st floor. As you came into the lobby, to the back on the right side, and Pat's apartment was top floor, left side. And so it must have been 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. Terry and Pat carried this tub out to the railing of the 4th floor. And of course, if you look over that railing, it's a direct drop to that lobby, which is the old hardwoods and tiles on the floor and everything. They turned this tub over, and this thing went down, and when it hit, I'm surprised it didn't wake the whole damn building up. And of course, all of us scattered, run to our room. And the next morning, on our way out, it was Mr. Aston and this guy who was kind of his maintenance guy are in the hallway, and you'd have to see this because when that mess hit that tile floor, it climbed the walls and dried. And so if you walk, here's oatmeal and God knows what else, and feathers sticking out of it, hanging off the walls. And that's what I called the Boston stew. That's the type of thing that went on. Oh, Lordy, Lordy, Lordy.
So he was a big prankster even early in his wrestling career.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, he was, Pat was just, he was a good guy, and so creative too. He was creative back then as well. Obviously not to the point that that he was later in later years. But when you realize the opportunities, the people that for him to work with Ray Stevens for so long. I mean, not that Pat himself wouldn't have been good with or without Ray, but some of Ray rubbed off on him, and some, and that was how it was back then, Brian, with all of us. You worked with guys above you all the time coming up, and as you did, you either got better or got the hell out of the way. And but yeah, he was an extremely talented guy, and honestly, a lot of fun to be around. And he was not bashful about his sexual orientation at all.
I was going to ask you about that because one of the things I've always found fascinating about Tony Santos's promotion is that there were a lot of wrestlers who were either openly gay or, in some cases, closeted gay to the outside world, but were known to be gay and not ashamed of it in the wrestling world. What was that like? I mean, was Tony Santos I never see pictures of him and think, oh, this must be a real liberal guy. But there were a lot of guys working for him that were openly gay. What was that like?
It was, well, you know what? I'm a Midwestern kid, 19 years old when I went to Boston, and I knew what gay people were, right? And I probably had met some, just didn't know it, right? And after a while, I thought, man, is that the induction into the wrestling business? You're right. Well, Goldie was gay, and of course Terry and Pat. And I can't speak for anybody else, but they were all, basically open with that. And, well, I mentioned you, I don't know, should I bring up what I told you before we started recording?
You can, and if I deem that it doesn't fit in the tribute, I'll edit it out, but please feel free to tell that story.
Well, it probably doesn't fit in the tribute. But Pat was, like I say, he was comfortable with it. And, we knew, it wasn't like he went into the arenas, he never came across, in the ring as gay, or it never played the Ricky Star or the Goldie or any of that, but he was not uncomfortable with it. And if he knew that people were, he would mess with them and as such. Now, I think this was more maybe a test for Alex Medina and myself, the story I'm about to tell, because we knew he was gay. Anyway, the three of us are leaving the rooming house, and we're going to Symphony Delicatessen, which is up on Mass Ave, just a few blocks from where we live. And so we're walking up the sidewalk, and here comes one of the college kids walking by, a young man, and for the life of me, I wasn't paying that close attention to him, but I'm assuming he's a decent-looking young guy, college student with some books and stuff. And as he walks by us, just out of the clear, and Pat doesn't turn, he just keeps looking straight ahead. He's walking. I'm on the inside, Alex in the middle, Pat's on the outside. And as the guy walks by, Pat keeps looking straight ahead and just says loud enough the guy had to have heard him, "Wow, I'd love to suck a big cock today." And Alex and I just came from stuff. What did he? I looked at Alex, and Alex said, "Yeah, I think he just said that." But Pat just smiled and kept on walking. Right? It was shock value. That's all I can say. It was shock value, But he was, like I say, and realize with him and Louis coming to my wedding, not that I cared, but Boston, I think, in terms of sexuality, was more liberal at that point in time than any other part, at least Cincinnati, where I came from. And a part of that, I think, because of the arts, and so forth. So they fit right in there. They fit right in.
Louis is obviously a big part of his story. They would remain together until Louis passed away. What do you remember about when Louis first appeared on the scene, and what can you tell us about their relationship as you witnessed it back in 1961?
Well, it was obvious that they were, I guess you'd say, smitten with one another, right? And Louis, again, it wasn't like he was, trying to hustle Pat. It appeared to be a good relationship, in terms of that. And it wasn't, just like to sit on the front steps there with Louis, sit there with Louis and Pat and talk. It wasn't like, hey, there's two gay guys and that straight guy there. It was just three guys talking, And Louis was comfortable with all of us. He fit right in, So it was. And apparently I've said this to people before, years even before Louis passed away, and I don't know anything about gay relationships or how they work or anything, obviously, but I thought, these guys have been together through thick and thin all the years that Pat's been in the business, and how many of us straight guys have gone through how many marriages in the same period of time, So maybe there's something to be said for that. I don't know. But Louis, I was dedicated to Pat. Obvious that there was a mutual respect, and in terms of social, what little he would come around the rooming house and sit with us on the front steps or in either Pat's room or Goldie's apartment. A lot of times the guys would go or walk the floor and see whose door is open, whose wasn't. But he fit right in. Nice guys, always. I didn't know him that well, but always struck me as a nice guy, and definitely, had a thing for Pat and respected him.
A few more questions for you today, Les. One, obviously you brought up a couple names that made me think of Jack Pfeffer, whether it was Black Magic or Haystacks Muldoon. So let me ask you, was Pfeffer around at all during this period of time? And also, did Tony Santos like Pat? I mean, was there any relationship between the promoter and the wrestler?
Well, you know what? Tony Santazaro, the first time I walked into his office in 1960, in February 1960, to start my training and to meet him for the first time, as I look back, my first thought would have been, if I were putting together a movie about fighting or fights or wrestling, this guy would have been the promoter, right? He was the guy, the big, heavy-set Italian guy, nice suit, snap brim hat, cigar in one corner of his mouth. That was Tony Santos. He looked the part. But when Pfeffer came to... Now, I'm under the impression, and this is a story I heard, I don't know if it's factual or not, but I'm assuming that it is. I've heard it from enough people in different times, is that at one point during Tony's early part of his promotional career, when he first started, he got into financial bind, and Pfeffer bailed him out. So he felt, beholding to Jack. So anytime Jack came to town, you knew that Jack was in town before you saw him because you saw the goofy names in the program, right? So, but Muldoon, Bill Toohey was a good humor driver for, I think, Montauk Point, Long Island. Yeah, he was. Drove a good humor truck in Montauk Point. How he came across Pfeffer or Pfeffer him, I have no idea. But Jack brought him to Boston to turn him into to Haystacks Muldoon. And so that was, and he used a lot of the guy I mentioned, Flash Thomas. I know, at one early on in the early 60s, before I ever, I'm not sure, late 50s, early 60s, if you took black wrestlers into the this part of the country, southeastern United States, they had to wrestle other black wrestlers. They didn't mix the black and white in ring. And I know Jimmy Thomas, I mentioned, who lived there in the house, that Jack used him later. After I'd already left up there, but I'd see advertisements and stuff where Jimmy was being used. So Jack would take guys out, but Jack brought guys in too. Buddy Fuller came in at one point. Jackie Fargo. Firpo was working for Pfeffer when he spent time up there. In fact, I remember because I was driving him around and several, you remember, ever seen pictures of the Bavarian boys?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. Well, they came to Boston occasionally. So Pfeffer, there was always that tie, but Jack wasn't there that much. I think maybe in the time 60 and 61 that I was there, maybe he was in town, maybe at the most 3 times, but twice I'm sure of.
Well, Les, after he leaves Boston, Pat would venture out west, go to Pacific Northwest, and that would begin his run of various places from there to San Francisco, West Texas, etc. You would end up going in other places. Do you remember the last time you saw Pat in Boston, and when was the next time you saw him after that?
Wow, a long time. We actually didn't bump heads again until, I'm trying to think. I guess back in the WWE time, or WWF, right? We never worked the same territories after that.
Right.
We were never in the same territories. Or if we were, it was at different times. I never got to the West Coast. And I'm trying to think. I'm going to guess probably next time. I'm trying to think if he was at the NWA meetings in Vegas since maybe, no, he was. I don't know. I'm going to say late 70s, early 80s, the next time I ran into him. But, of course, I don't know about everybody else, but, I always followed the careers of the guys that I more or less started with, And so I always try to keep track of those guys. And I followed it. I thought, wow, this guy he's on fire, And there's no doubt. I mean, I had a chance to work with Ray Stevens later in Ray's career, but I never worked with the two of them as a team, and I could only imagine what a great time you could have had, to work with these two guys. They were just that tremendous.
Les, wrapping things up, how do you think Pat Patterson should be remembered, and how will you remember him?
I remember him as a really good guy who is extremely talented in the ring, and obviously has brought a lot of creativity, a good finish man, a prankster, a guy with a great sense of humor. And basically, I guess I always looked at a lot of the guys that I broke, when I broke in at 60, 61, a lot of the guys we've just talked about were already working for a year, 2 or 3. But I always felt like we were the graduating class together. So I always try to keep track of all those guys. But I'd say Pat needs to be remembered as a guy who loved the business. And I do know from talking to him in recent years that he wasn't all that excited about the way the business was going. He didn't say that publicly. But, like a circus, it's circus. And, but great finish guy. Royal Rumble, Survivor Series were both his brainchild. So, you got to remember him if you don't remember him for the first ever Intercontinental Champion, you got to remember him for being a talented worker, a great creative mind, and just a real good guy who loved the business and contributed a lot. I think there'll be a big void in the business. And I think, you've seen it too, Brian. So many guys who say what they've learned from Pat. And I would, if I look back, I'm saying I must have learned something then too. I mean, he wasn't as green as me, but we were both, kind of out there trying to find our way. But I do remember it was never a problem working with the guy. He was smooth as silk.
Coming out of Boston, Pat Patterson would head to the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But Bertrand, what we just heard Les talk about were his memories of meeting Louis in Boston. And of course, Louis Dondero would be a big part of Pat Patterson's story, a big part of Pat Patterson's life. What can you tell us about his relationship with Louis?
I mean, it was the love of his life. That's his words. The book is dedicated to him. And it was someone who made Pat's life complete. I mean, he actually goes to Portland following Mad Dog's invitation, and he's leaving Louis behind. But, they miss each other so much that Louis would quit his job and move at the other side of the country to be with Pat. And they would be together for the next 40 years, which all of in itself is amazing in wrestling or in any kind of part of life, to be together 40 years with the same person. And Louis was the person who kept Pat grounded in reality all those years. Louis was the guy that charms anyone that was unsure about the fact that Pat was gay. He would charm the pants out of them. I mean, Roy Schire, first thing he tells Pat is, I heard you're gay. And by the time he meets Louis, he goes and get his hair cut by Louis all the time and hires Louis to do some work for his parties. So that's how Louis was. He would win people over because he was cultivated. He could talk about everything, and people genuinely love Louis. So he's the difference maker in Pat's life, basically. He turns Pat into that serious person that doesn't let wrestling take over his life.
And of course, like you said, he would eventually follow Pat to the Pacific Northwest, to Portland. But before we get to there, let's talk a little bit about Pat's relationship with Mad Dog Vachon. Talk a little bit about Pat and Mad Dog.
You see, Mad Dog was already becoming a star, and in Portland, he was a big star in the U.S., but he would come back periodically to Montreal, and that's when he ended up being on a show with Pat in his early days in Montreal. Pat tells it is like everybody was scared of Mad Dog because, he lived the gimmick, so nobody wanted to get in his way, talk to him, or anything like that. And he saw once Mad Dog punch his best friend in the face because he was annoying him. So it's like, if he's punching his best friend, I'm staying the hell away from Maurice. And because, Pat loved to say, I'm not a tough guy. I just play one on TV. And then after a match that Pat had, Maurice is there waiting for him in the hallway. And he's like, you're going to make a good wrestler. Pat was so scared that he just continued. And to this day, Pat never knew how Mad Dog ended up knowing where he was. And out of the blue, he got a letter from Maurice telling him he had a starting date in Portland. But, obviously working Boston at that point, Pat barely makes any money. So he doesn't have the money to go, and he doesn't know where Portland is. And, Santos doesn't want to let him go. He's making the big show about the big map, and he's telling him how long and far away Portland is from Boston. And so Pat is scared and doesn't go. So Mad Dog actually sent a second letter telling him, you better get here. Or he's going to beat him up or something. So, he borrows money from Louis. You see how important Louis is in that story. And Pat moves to Portland to be with Maurice. And then, that would be the first territory, the first real territory, if you will, where Pat would become someone. Although that's the first run. And he would become the big star that we know that move on to San Francisco on the second run.
And of course, Louis follows him. And like you said, he won everyone over. He won Mad Dog Vachon over, which Pat was worried about.
Yeah. So, out of the blue. And that's the part about that you have to always remember. I mean, neither Pat or I chose the name of the book. But at the time, Maurice knew that Pat was gay. The word got around, but it's not like, Pat is telling anyone or, flashing it to anyone. So out of the blue one night, Maurice go and see Pat, and Louis is there. And he had met Louis when Pat had brought him to Montreal on one trip back. So that's like, he goes berserk, and then Louis got scared because, oh my God, we're going to get discovered, So Maurice get Pat in the car, is like, let's go, we're going to get him. And they finally found him. And, I think Pat tells the story much better than I could ever. But, Pat said, I thought he was going to kill him or something. And they ended up going to the bar because Maurice told him, okay, let's go drink now. And by the end of the night, Maurice was more friend with Louis than he was with Pat. Because, Maurice loved to talk, loved to different subjects, and, Louis could talk about anything. And after that point, in Portland, Louis became, he told, because that was very boring. I mean, they were on the road, Pat and Maurice, and it's like, okay, what are we going to, you're not leaving Louis alone. So bring Louis with us. Well, Pat, Maurice, I cannot tell people, what I'm going to, he's my friend. Louis is my friend. He's coming with us. So instead of being Pat's friend, Louis was Maurice's friend. So nobody questioned it. So, hiding in plain sight. And, when Maurice would have his fight with his wife and the police would ask Maurice to spend the night elsewhere, well, he would sleep on the Louis' couch. So that's the kind of relationship they build up there.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Pat Patterson in Portland. And let's go to this conversation with wrestling historian Matt Farmer. We continue our look at Pat Patterson, this time focusing on the period of time he spent in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm very happy to welcome to the Superpodcast the historian Matt Farmer. Matt, thanks for being here today.
Ryan, it's great to be here. I appreciate it, man. It's good to talk to you finally.
Well, it's great to have you on the show finally, and it's great to talk about Pat Patterson in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, it isn't just the area of the country that you live in, but it's a place that you've done a lot of research for, a place that you know a lot of the history. And on that topic, talk a little bit about what Pacific Northwest wrestling, what Don Owen wrestling was like before Pat Patterson got there in 1962.
Well, it was pretty interesting because the Pacific Northwest was in I would say kind of like a golden era at the time. Portland was doing great under Don Owen, and I guess the best way to describe it would also be like a satellite promotion. So really quickly, Portland was kind of broken into two different territories. You had Portland, which was on Channel 12, which was taped every Friday night at the Portland Armory. Don Owen ran it. And then every Tuesday, there was a separate television in Seattle, taped for Cairo Television on Channel 7, which was ran and operated by Harry Elliott. Now, Harry was a longtime employee / worker promoter for the Owen family. and he would run a lot of spot shows and things like that in Oregon and Washington, dating way back to Don's father, Herb. So Harry got television in Seattle. He ran his own towns throughout the state of Washington, Idaho, and northeastern Oregon. And then Don had Oregon, and he had a bunch of towns in Oregon, of course. So both territories at the time, both cities, and of course, all the talent was booked out of the Portland office, but both sections of the territory were thriving. They were doing really great business at the time. There was a lot of big stars in the area, a lot of young, hungry talent. And so that's what Pat was walking into in 1962.
Now, it's been said that the reason he went there was he was called for by Mad Dog Vachon. How big a star was Mad Dog Vachon in the area at that time?
Really big. He was probably, at the time, he was probably the biggest heel at the time, like the major force. And it was right when he was getting that nickname Mad Dog. And that very famous photo you see of Mad Dog Vachon with the chains wrapped around him and things like that, that really famous promo pic, that was taken in Portland. And it was Don who christened the name Mad Dog. So he was really breaking into his own himself. You know, the territory was picking up, buildings were picking up, and so he would have been like the top heel at the time.
He was the top heel. Pat Patterson would come in also on the heel side. Who were the top baby faces in 62?
You had guys like Pepper Martin, Nick Bockwinkel, Shag Thomas, Luther Lindsay. Yeah, a lot of guys like that.
So how did Pat Patterson fit in right away when he got there?
When he was first brought in, it was as a preliminary guy, and it was just a guy that, you know, he didn't have a reputation. He'd only been in the business for a few years. And I think he was just brought in, like Don liked to bring in like a lot of young, nice looking baby faces. It was just something that was his family always did. It was a territory that would usually have 4 to 5 matches per card. And so you wanted that preliminary guy, the young preliminary guy, to come in and just kind of like get the attention of the girls and things like that. And that's where Pat's position was.
And looking at the results, he didn't win a lot of matches the first couple of years in the area.
No, but he was, you know, very inexperienced still at the time, because I think he'd only been to 2 spots before. I mean, he was coming straight from Boston, so his experience level probably wasn't there yet.
When did things change? When did all of a sudden he start getting elevated on the cards, and how did that go?
Well, it's kind of interesting with Pat, because when he was in the Portland arm of the territory, he was working as Killer Pat Patterson, where he was working as a heel. And then in the Seattle portion of the territory, he started working under the Pretty Boy Pat Patterson gimmick, which was kind of like the more flamboyant, I'd say almost like kind of like a Gorgeous George type character. And it was around that time where he really started picking up, which would have only been just a few months after his arrival.
Were there towns in either Washington or Oregon where you had an overlap of the TV show?
There were, yeah. A lot of southern Washington, which would have been like Chehalis, Washington, Longview, Washington, things like, a lot of southern towns. The Portland TV would also air in some parts of eastern Washington too, but it was pretty rare. They had both TVs at the time, especially, would air in a town.
While in Portland, he started teaming with Tony Bourne. Talk a little bit about where Tony Bourne was at that point in his career.
Yeah, Tony was also, like with Mad Dog Vachon, he was like one of the top heels at the time. You know, he was like one of those guys who was like considered like a hometown guy in Portland. And Tony was just like the ever-present heel. But they had a very successful tag team, and it was kind of like Tony was like the guy that helped elevate Pat into like a main eventer here in the Northwest.
Well, they had a successful tag team, but then they also had a successful feud. What can you tell us about that?
That was one of the Don Owen-like booking philosophies where he would have, and it was something that Tony Bourne redid throughout his career, whether it was with Shag Thomas or with Lonnie Main. He would be a longtime tag team partner with a partner and then turn on the guy. And that's what he did with Pat Patterson. where, they had been teaming for a long time and then all of a sudden turned on them. And it would embroil into a big feud that would run across the territory. It's interesting because while both the Seattle and Portland arms had their own television, they ran their own angles, but it sometimes continued the same angles too. And that was one of the angles that ran throughout the entire territory.
Tony Bourne against Pat Patterson.
Correct, yes.
What were the big highlights of that feud?
Okay, so the big match that they had was in 1964. So Pat had been around for a while. He left to Texas and came back. And when he came back, he was actually kind of a bigger star at the time. So in November of 1964, they had their big hair match. And it was one of those deals where the big payoff was, of course, Pat losing his hair. And then following that, it was the fans in each town wanted to see the bald Pat Patterson. But of course, what Pat did is he did the old gimmick where he wore a mask. And so they would fight Pat to take the mask off at every town. So that way they could show off the bald head, and that was one of the gimmicks that ran throughout the territory for quite a while.
It wasn't that much longer. It was just at the beginning of 1965 where he would finally go to work for Roy Schire in San Francisco. But what can you tell me about the relationship between the two offices, the San Francisco office and Don Owen's office?
Well, they did share a lot of talent because it was so easy to commute between the two. Even when Pat became a big star in San Francisco, him and Ray Stevens would come up to Portland or Seattle to work the big shows here. It wasn't uncommon for them to fly in just for a shot at, like, say, the Seattle Center Arena or the Portland Coliseum or something like that. Because in the 60s, Don was running the Coliseum occasionally to kind of like the big show that they would build to instead of running the Portland Armory or the Labor Temple or something like that.
Obviously, Pat would go on to greater fame in San Francisco, becoming one of the Blonde Bombers and eventually a pretty lengthy and legendary run there. But when you look at his period of time working for Don Owen, his period of time working in Portland and Seattle and the surrounding towns, what do you think Portland means to the Pat Patterson story?
I think with Pat, and this is something that I've actually talked to Pat about, or promoters that worked with Pat during this time, is it was almost a coming out period, both as a performer and also personally as well, because as we all know, he was homosexual, and being a gay man in the 1960s was extremely difficult. It was in Seattle and it was in Portland where he actually came out in the industry as well. And his partner Louis was out here. And as a matter of fact, when Louis was in Seattle, Harry Elliott used Louis to be Pat's valet. And I think it was the only time Louis was ever really involved in the wrestling business as far as a performer. But Louis was his valet. And there were times where they would have Pat come to the ring in a Cadillac, and Louis would be driving, kind of like, similar to like how Gorgeous George did the same thing with his valets. But for Pat, that was a big deal for him personally, as well. And he was always very fond of the Northwest because he felt like it was one of the few places in the country at the time, along with San Francisco, where he could be a little bit more of himself. One of the things also about the Northwest during that time is when he was able to wrestle a lot of those guys that were in the main events, guys like Nick Bockwinkel and Tony Bourne, and Pepper Martin was another one of his big feuds. These were guys that he was able to really learn his craft, because that was he was a preliminary wrestler moving up into the main events. And that's really where he learned how to become a main event caliber performer. He used to brag about his matches with Pepper Martin, for instance, because Pepper was one of the big baby faces out here. And they would go on to switch the heavyweight championship back and forth between the two of them a few times. And that was a major feud in the Seattle, Portland area too. And of course, in 1964, there was another young guy in the Northwest wrestling under the name Kazumoto, who would later go on to be known as Antonio Inoki. It was in the Northwest where Pat Patterson and Antonio Inoki became good friends, but they were also in-ring rivals for a short period of time in the Northwest, and that led to years later, in 1968, Pat Patterson going to Japan and becoming a major opponent for Antonio Inoki.
Coming out of Portland, Pat would get the biggest break of his career so far, and that would be going to San Francisco to work for Roy Schire. Bertrand, what did Pat tell you about his first thoughts about Roy Schire, and what did he know or what was he expecting going into San Francisco?
Well, the other guys told Pat, you should call Roy Schire because you're perfect for him. You're the type of wrestler that's great. You should be teaming with Ray Stevens. You do a good business there. So that's how Pat presented it to Schire. And he's like, well, the boys don't tell me what I do. But, he ends up giving Pat a chance. And after the first night, Pat came home and said to Louis, I don't think we're going to make it here long because he doesn't like gay guy. And then, by the time Pat left, he was basically running San Francisco for Roy Schire as the right-hand man. And Louis was very close to Roy as well. And Roy never questioned it, because that's the one thing that's different about Louis and Pat is maybe they didn't go on the street and manifest and demand rights and to be equal or things of that nature. They showed up at work. They did what they were supposed to do. They were consistent. They were just good people. And they showed that you could be gay and just be someone that was normal, that you just happen to be gay, but you were a good person, good worker, and a good friend, or a good cook, or a good singer, or so it just it changed people's perception, and by changing people's perception, those people change the perception of people around them or their family. So that's what they did, and I think that's what they were so good together, is that they showed an image of what gay couple maybe what we may be today more used to, but back then, that's not the image that gay had, and slowly, just by being themselves, doing it their way, they changed people's perception.
Let's talk a little bit more about Pat Patterson in the Bay Area for Roy Schire. Here's my conversation with wrestling historian Rock Rims. To discuss Pat Patterson's career in Northern California, I am very happy today to welcome back to the Super Podcast Rock Rims, who amongst several great wrestling books was of course the author of When It Was Big Time, a 100-year history of Northern California professional wrestling. Rock, thanks for being here today.
Oh, Brian, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's great to be on the show again.
Talking about Pat Patterson, he arrived in San Francisco at the start of 1965. If you're going to go back to that time period, what was the layout? What was the San Francisco promotion like, Roy Shire's promotion in 1964 into 1965?
At that time, it really come off of probably the two strongest years that he would have in the history of his promotion. And of course, when you have wrestling territories, you're always looking for new blood, new faces to kind of keep things going. And so the opportunity was there for him. And in fact, Ray was out of the area for a little while, and Pat came in, and he had an opportunity. So the opportunity was there for him to shine. And after some time, he really did.
And he didn't arrive as a blonde, correct?
No, he was dark-haired. He had been dark-haired working in Portland. Pepper Martin, who had known Roy Schire from working back in Indianapolis, was in the territory, and he put in a good word for Pat to come inside of the territory. It was dark-haired, and Pat had suggested to Roy that, hey, people would say that Ray Stevens and of course, Ray Stevens was basically the cornerstone of the promotion as far as the wrestling talent. And had led to was part of some of the biggest record-breaking crowds that they ever had at the Cow Palace for wrestling. I really set the territory on fire, and so Pat suggested, that people had compared him to Ray Stevens, and that he felt that they would be a great compliment as a tag team. And when he came in, we had dark hair. It was short. He had just lost a hair match back in the Pacific Northwest And so it was coming in its natural dark color. And eventually he said, Roy told him, yes, why don't you go ahead, we're going to dye your hair blonde and we'll match you as a partner for Ray Stevens. And thus the Blonde Bombers was formed.
So the fans got to see that. They got to see him come in as a heel with dark hair, and then all of a sudden, once Ray Stevens returns, he's a blonde. How did the fans react to that?
Well, Ray Stevens was pretty much taking the lead on the promos, but, Ray Stevens, and of course, very integral part of the promos that Ray and Pat did was to put down the wrestling fans. That was something that was still kind of new and novel at that time in pro wrestling, where you put down the local fans. And so that's one of the ways they really got heat through their interviews. They hated them. I mean, partly it was guilty by association, just for the fact that he's with paired with Ray Stevens, who was voted the most hated heel, and ironically, just because of his charisma, had also been voted the most popular in the promotion in the very same year. But it was just an instant hit as far as gaining heat, and they just skyrocketed to the top.
And of course, they did have a somewhat similar style. I mean, they both did the bombs away.
Yeah, so they both did the bombs away. Pat learned quite a bit from Ray in the ring, but of course, Pat had his own flavor, and then later on he blossomed. But just their chemistry was incredible, both on the microphone, in the ring. There are people that I think they just have a natural knack. Of course, they have exposure from other great wrestling talents, and also their experience that they acquire to hone their skills. But there are just some people who just basically have a natural knack for pro wrestling. They're gifted. I mean, this is what they were born to do. And it just happened to be, by chance that you had two of them were working in the same territory, and were working as partners at the same time, in the same era.
In researching when it was big time, I know you spoke to a lot of the different fans, the Bay Area fans who saw Stevens and Patterson. What did they say? I mean, they had seen various wrestlers come and go, but what did they think of that unit, that tag team?
Pretty much the kind of consensus that, they go along with what Dory Funk Jr. said. Dory Funk Jr. said that they were probably the greatest tag team of the 60s. The Bay Area fans would agree with that, but even go beyond that, and many of them said that they were the greatest tag team of all time. But definitely probably the greatest tag team of the 60s, not just in Northern California, but anywhere.
They had, an almost 2-year run as the World Tag Team Champions?
Exactly, as the World Tag Team Champions, and then not just in San Francisco, they also defended in Hawaii. They did tours of the Pacific Northwest, and at that time in Northern California, you had some of the greatest talent coming in. I mean, Roy Schire was a genius. He wasn't a very affable person, he wasn't exactly a very congenial, but he was a great businessman, and he was able to maintain connections with people that he worked with in the various territories. A lot of people forget that he was a great talent in the ring before becoming a great promoter, and he paid well. He was smart enough to understand that in order to get great talent, he had to pay them well enough to give them the incentive to go in there and work for him, whether it's a short-term or long-time basis. So he had some of the greatest talent. His network with Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett, Joe Blanchard. He had a lot of great talent was funneling into there at various times. So, it was just incredible.
What was the relationship like, to the best of your knowledge, between Pat Patterson and Roy Schire, especially in those early years?
Roy was not the most tolerant man, in a personal level. He didn't really care for people of color too much. He definitely didn't care for, homosexuals, people who were of different sexuality. He was very blunt with Pat, when their first TV taping that they did, even before, Pat ever worked the Cow Palace show, Roy turned around and blankly asked Pat in the car ride. I guess they were just familiarizing each other. Pat didn't know the area, so he was riding with Roy, and Roy turned around and said, I heard you're queer. I mean, not exactly the most sensitive question you can ask someone, but, over time, though, even though Roy didn't really, care for things like people who were different, he understood green. He understood money. So he realized that Pat was a great talent, and he can make great money with him. And of course he did. So he started to develop a respect for him, about as much respect as you can expect from somebody like Roy Schire.
So Pat comes in as a heel. Him and Stevens become a tag team. They take off. And then towards the end of the decade, some things start to change. Pat takes the better part of a year to go to West Texas and work for the Funks. Ray Stevens is doing various things. I know he goes to Australia. And by the time they're both in the territory again at the same time, Ray Stevens is now a babyface, and Pat Patterson, who was the junior member of the tag team, is now the heel. Talk a little bit about this, and of course, what would lead into a major feud, Pat Patterson versus Ray Stevens.
Yeah, as we mentioned, it's important to keep things fresh, and you really weren't going to go wrong with having Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson. And we're talking in the territory days, people didn't really stay in the area too long unless they were, successful, maybe 6 months at the most. If they were doing really well, maybe they might stay a year. I mean, these guys were there for years. The question is what to do with them. You still need to keep things fresh. So Ray comes back. He comes back from a tour in Japan. And the storyline was essentially that, that during that time, he's chilling with Bruno Sammartino, who had engaged in a feud not too long before at the Cow Palace and in Japan. And he comes back and he says, well, I've changed my ways. I started wrestling a little bit differently when I was in Japan. So now I'm going to, wrestle a little bit differently. And so now he becomes a baby face. And the storyline was that Pat Patterson was upset. He expected, here comes Ray, things are going to be the same. We're going to take over again, just like we did before. The boys are back in town, we're going to run amok. And that was not the case. He was very disappointed. And so he had a lot of resentment. It wasn't just a matter of rivalry in the ring, and rivalry over a championship. It was a lot of resentment that basically Ray had turned his back on him, And so now you had the two biggest stars in the territory, and they're going to face each other. I mean, it was a dream matchup, But and it was interesting because you had the fans were divided, even though Pat was a heel, there was some who really, it was one of those territories in San Francisco where you actually had a little greater amount of fans who actually loved the heels over the baby faces. So when they would get in the ring, Ray was the favorite, but Pat still did have a pretty strong following, and even some of the fans felt that Ray basically had betrayed Pat Patterson. So it was very, very intense, feud that they had in the ring, and they just produced some incredible magical moments.
And there were some weird moments in terms of injuries that happened in the middle of that feud, because didn't Patterson break his leg against Stevens, and then Stevens, I forget the exact injury, but he got hurt in another racing accident before one of their matches, right?
The Stevens stuff happened prior to. Well, actually, no, that's right. Ray got hurt so many damn times. But Pat legitimately did break his leg trying to do bombs away, and ended up on the concrete floor. So it was a legitimate injury, which they actually worked into an angle that was, during the time he was recuperating, coming back, that provided some of the more hilarious promos, prior to his Pat's return to the ring. But yes, when they finally were going to get together, and this is the second time it happened. The first time it happened with Pepper Gomez, where just Ray, his extracurricular activities, this is he went motorcycle hill climbing. He would race at Sonoma on the motorcycles. He was involved in rodeos and so forth. But yeah, he had another injury. This time it was a go-kart racing, although the story actually changed a couple of times. Some fans were told that it was a bull race. He was riding bulls in Bakersfield at a rodeo, and then the door swung open on the gate, hit him in the face. But he actually was in a go-kart race, and he broke his jaw. His face was all bruised up, and they were supposed to meet. And instead of that evening, Ray shows up at the Cow Palace, and he's dressed up in a suit. And his face, he's obviously is bearing looking the worse for wear. And he has to forfeit the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. And thus, Pat, without having to actually wrestle Ray, is now the United States Heavyweight Champion.
To fast forward a little bit ahead, because they are so interconnected, Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens, Pat would, of course, stay around for several years after Ray Stevens left for the AWA. Why did Ray Stevens leave San Francisco?
It was a combination of things. Partly he had been there for so long in San Francisco. But a big part of it was he was having tax problems. I mean, he was having tax problems that went back for over a decade. Back when he was in Indianapolis, when he first started working for Roy in Northern California, he was already having tax issues, whether it's the IRS and before he settled it in court. So he was still having tax issues. Ray, basically, he would go through money faster than he can make it. He was always buying the latest toys. He was very generous with his friends. He'd pick up the tabs and so forth. And it was just like basically like he suffered from Peter Pan syndrome. He just never grew up. And for a lot of guys, a lot of people, they felt there was always another payday. For a talent like Ray Stevens, there often was, but just very, very terrible with the money. And so as a result, he got in trouble with the IRS too. And so he had a chance to be able to basically reinvent himself to some extent in a new territory. And Vanguard had been pursuing him for a long time and offered to help him with his tax problems, as well as give him, a strong push in the AWA. And so Ray took advantage of it and left in 1971.
And obviously that changes things in San Francisco because other than some brief stays away where he went to Australia or, a few other places, Ray Stevens was the mainstay in San Francisco. And now he's gone, really puts Pat in even a bigger position there. And of course, shortly after that, he would start teaming with superstar Billy Graham. What can you tell us about superstar Billy Graham's emergence in San Francisco and Pat Patterson's role in getting him over?
Well, Billy and Pat actually were teaming before Ray had left. So actually, he was even a great influence on him as well too. But of course, teaming with Pat, on the road and working night in and night out. I mean, Billy Graham, and rightfully so, he was so green at the time, but he gave Pat a lot of credit. I believe in his autobiography, he refers to working for his time working for Roy Schire, being around Roy Schire, working with Pat night in and night out, working against Ray on the opposite side of the ring, as his master's degree in market manipulation, essentially ring psychology. And that's really was the strongest part of Billy Graham's game. It wasn't really his ring work, but it was his promo skills and of course his ability to employ psychology in the ring. And so, Pat's influence over Billy, and Billy's, has never been shy about, giving him credit, was tremendous. It was a tremendous impact. Billy came in from LA where he wasn't used all that well because he just frankly wasn't a very good worker, but he had Charlie Moto in Southern California was helping him out some, but Charlie had a tremendous amount of responsibility, so he couldn't really be a strong tutor for him, and he was partnering with Jerry Graham, which he could learn something from, but Jerry was face down in his vomit half the time, unfortunately, and so he couldn't have had as much of an impact on Billy as he possibly could have. So it was a tremendous time for Billy Graham. Probably the time period which he learned the most in professional wrestling was working alongside Pat.
Let's talk about 1972, where Pat Patterson finally turns babyface in San Francisco. What can you tell us about that?
That was a situation. He had been teaming often with Paul DeMarco and Lars Anderson and with some of the other heels. And there was a situation where they were rivals for the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. And so Rocky Johnson came to his aid when he was when Pat was being double teamed in the ring by Anderson and DeMarco. And it was just kind of one of those things, where it was a fluke thing. It was kind of an instinctive, response on the part of Rocky. It was kind of more like the enemy of the enemy is my friend kind of situation. And but the response, that the fans had to the idea that perhaps, Pat could turn into a baby face was overwhelming, and fans could be, pro wrestling fans could be such fickle bunches, so they ran with it, and he was just as loved as he had been hated when he was a heel.
Do you think he enjoyed being a babyface after years of being one of the top heels?
Yeah, I would say he did. I don't think he's really concerned about the fans' reception. As a heel, if you're able to do your job effectively, you want the fans to hate you. It means more money in your pocket. It means you're doing your job. But it prolonged his longevity in the promotion. San Francisco was such a great place to work because you got paid well. The drives were short. For Pat Patterson, also too, the community that he lived in, for someone who's homosexual, it was a lot more comfortable community for him to live in. So he loved the lifestyle. He loved where he was living. He loved Northern California, And, so if he was able to prolong his stay in his career there and by turning babyface, he was all for it.
Now, Pat would eventually win the annual San Francisco Battle Royal, and I believe it's the Battle Royal in San Francisco, and of course LA had one too. But knowing of those and thinking about those and being a part of those, that helped lead to the creation of the Royal Rumble, correct?
That's what it definitely had an influence him. Their battle royals were a lot different than battle royals elsewhere. Other places battle royal was just basically was a gimmick, to have once in a while. There wasn't any real rhyme or reason for it. That you haven't had one for a while. It was novel, and let's go ahead and let's have one. You can have one, every couple of months, on the card. But in LA and in San Francisco, the annual battle royals were quite different. They were spectacles. It was basically the Super Bowl of professional wrestling for their territories, particularly LA, because of the proximity where it was located. They got a lot of coverage in the wrestling magazines from that, whereas more so than they normally did because of the battle royal. In San Francisco, Roy was really the one that invented it. It was something that Mike LaBelle went ahead and borrowed the idea. I asked Roy for suggestions and ideas, and so they can go ahead and develop one of their own. But it was, like I said, it was a huge event. It was a Super Bowl of the year, and you had all these wrestlers come in from other areas as well too. We're flying for that event. So it was really an extravaganza. It wasn't just a gimmick match in San Francisco.
Once Pat turned babyface, was it a big deal when he would reunite with Ray Stevens as a tag team?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When the pairing of Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson was always magic, regardless of whether they were on opposite sides of the ring or whether they were as partners. When they came in, when Ray would come in, occasionally they actually wrestled a few times. And neither one of them was necessarily a heel at that time. Of course, they developed a storyline that would facilitate tension between the two characters, because you got to have some kind of, tension between them in order to make it more interesting and appealing. No one wants to see a straight up in a scientific match. So, but when they actually joined together to reunite as a team, even if briefly, fans loved it. Anytime you can see them in the ring together, whether they're on the same team or whether they're pairing up together, fans went crazy for it.
In mid-1977, Pat would end up in Florida. And really for the next several years, from Florida to the AWA to the WWF, he would be done with San Francisco. I know he won the Battle Royal in 81, but that was a completely different San Francisco than he had left before. What can you tell us about why he left San Francisco and the relationship with Roy Schire? What happened between the two of them?
Well, Pat was able to benefit everyone who worked for Roy Schire always benefited to some extent. Anyone who really was really took advantage of the situation. There are people who were experienced seasoned pros. Were just stars who went in there to work for Roy, and they came away and said, I was an even better wrestler after working for Roy. He was a phenomenal businessman. He was a tremendous genius with a great mind for the business and for the psychology. And of the art form. So Pat benefited greatly from it, but, just as Ray Stevens had done, Ray had benefited so much from Roy, but at the same time, he was his own individual and he had his own innate abilities. And so he was able to grow from that in his own way as well. He had his own traits, strong traits as a wrestler. The same thing for Pat. He didn't really need Roy as a mentor after a while, but he learned tremendously from him. Always gave him credit, for teaching him so much about the business. But I think after a while, you don't want to be the pupil anymore. You want to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. He was given a greater amount of responsibility, over the years. Roy was always at the TV tapings in Sacramento. He was always at the Cow Palace shows. He was at the Sacramento house shows because he had an interest. He was a booking agent. People sometimes mistakenly think that Roy Schire was the promoter of Northern California. He was the booking agent of Northern California. You can only be really a promoter in one. Sometimes, in the case of Roy, because they made allowances for him because of all the money that his shows contributed, to the state, he was not only the promoter in San Francisco but also co-promoter in Sacramento. But he was a booking agent for the area, and he would have Pat essentially be his emissary on the road. He would be basically, booking things. He would be the booker in the individual towns, making sure that everything was going according to the way Roy would have wanted it to go, and the wrestlers were being used properly. He was given the finishes. He would oversee things. He was a strong influence in the town of Modesto, where we had a great relationship with promoter Johnny Miller there. And so he had a vested interest there. He wanted to get a piece of the promotion from Roy. And he'd been there a long time. He was willing to invest money. But Roy, it was a control freak. And he didn't want to give that to Pat. He had a lot of respect for Pat, gave him a lot of responsibility. I don't think he ever gave him quite his just due. And I think Pat was outgrowing his then current role as far as top star and not only and also essentially booker, without necessarily having the booker talent title, I should say. And so they were butting heads. There was conflict, over the issue. Roy, then he offered to straight out buy the promotion out from Roy, but Roy wasn't willing to sell. And so that, again, there was more conflict there. There was a conflict over a situation, presumably a legal situation. I don't know if there's any truth to that. I know that's just a rumor, and that's from Bob Roop, but I think, you have to take anything Bob Roop says, about Roy Schire with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because of his personal feelings. But essentially, it was really over the way, Pat's role was. He had outgrown his current role, and he wanted to basically invest in the promotion. Roy wasn't having it, and they clashed over it. And that's what led to Pat's departure. I mean, he, had offers elsewhere, so he decided to take up the offers in Florida.
Yeah, there was a story, and I don't remember all the details, in your book. Wasn't there an incident between Roy and some bikers, and Pat was there but didn't get involved? Am I remembering things correctly?
No, that's correct. And that's the situation that Bob Roop says, led to conflict between Roy and Pat. I don't know that it did. I've never been able to get any confirmation on that. They were on the road in Sacramento area, and there was a road accident. There was a contingent of bikers, the Hells Angels. There was an accident. A couple of them were injured. They thought Roy was at fault, and essentially Roy ended up getting out of the vehicle and reaching for his gun in the briefcase. They jumped him, and Pat stood in the car, and so that may have also caused some conflict too. Was it because Pat stayed in the car? I mean, actually, Roy did tell Pat, look after Roy's son, and which Pat did, but at the same time, Pat didn't also get out to help Roy at all, But Roy bumps and some bruises, but no serious injuries. Roop's contention was that Pat wanted to perjure himself, or Roy wanted Pat to perjure himself during the court case involved with that, but there's nothing that I've seen that's come across that validates any claims that Roop might have made regarding that.
Pat would leave San Francisco. He would leave Roy Shire's promotion. And like we said before, he would go to Florida. He would go to the AWA, eventually the World Wrestling Federation. And in 1981, by that point in time, Vern Gagne is running San Francisco, and Pat wins the annual Battle Royal. What can you tell us about that period of time in San Francisco? And at that point, 1981, a lot of things have happened. The business had changed. San Francisco was not what it had previously been. How much did Stevens and Patterson still mean to that area?
When Roy had his 1981 Battle Royal, actually was Roy's Battle Royal. Well, actually, let me go ahead and clarify that a little bit. A couple of weeks prior to Roy's final wrestling show at Cow Palace, which was in January 1981, it was Battle Royal. Vern Gagne had his own wrestling show in Oakland, across the bay. And so Vern had already had TV set up there for several months and was having his show being broadcast in the area, and then had his first show a few weeks prior to Roy's last show. And Pat flew in, won a 1981 Battle Royal for Roy. Roy wasn't too happy about, Pat working Vern's show a couple weeks prior, but we already had Pat booked for his show, and of course, Pat was just a tremendous, one of the greatest stars ever in the Northern California area. So, he wasn't going to not have Pat on the show. I think it was very fitting that Pat went over in that battle royal, the final one that Roy would have, and there was announcements for our show in February that was not to be. Roy's final show was that Cow Palace show. Vern Gagne essentially took over the area in Northern California from that point on. It was very important for Pat and Ray to be a part of Vern's promotion in whatever extent that they could be. Vern was smart. He understood that. Leo Nominelli, who was the local promoter for essentially the front man for Vern Gagne in the Bay Area, understood that as well too. So you'd have these heels, even when Ray and Pat were not going to be in the show, weren't even anticipated to even be coming in for several months. In fact, heels would go and do their television promos for the local shows in Northern California, and they'd be challenging Ray and Pat. They weren't even looking to face them for several months, but they knew that they can get over by invoking their names and issuing the challenge. I mean, that's just how huge they were. I mean, even a decade over. I mean, 30, 40 years after Pat had last left or last worked for Roy Schire, they were still inviting Pat. Various local promoters were inviting Pat to come down and do their shows and reunions and so forth, and do signings and meet and greet. And it was just had an overwhelming response. I mean, they were just so strongly identified with Bay Area wrestling, both Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. I mean, over a decade after Ray retired, I mean, they made it Ray Stevens Day, in the Bay Area. You just cannot separate. I mean, for a lot of people, when you think of Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens in terms of Northern California pro wrestling, they were Northern California pro wrestling.
Well, that kind of goes into my final question, Rock. Looking back on the entirety of Pat Patterson's run in San Francisco, what is the legacy he leaves behind?
That you always got your money's worth when you watch Pat. I mean, just extremely compelling performer, and all the way around. He had all the tools, all the gifts. His role that he played was integral in the success of Roy Shire's promotion. For off and on for like 17 years. I mean, he did it all. He was a babyface. He was a heel. He was a champion. He was essentially the booker. He's just one of the cornerstones of the history of that region's pro wrestling history. I mean, it wouldn't have been the same without Pat Patterson. Just one of those things where the opportunity presented itself to him, and he was able to take advantage of it. And people, like I said, as I mentioned before, when people talk about San Francisco wrestling, for many of them, it was Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. So it wouldn't have been the same when Pat hadn't been there. I mean, his impact was just tremendous. And decades later on, people still fondly remember in detail the way they made him feel, and they're grateful for it, whether he made them love him or whether he made them hate them. They're very appreciative of all his contributions to the body of work in Northern California pro wrestling.
Bertrand, of course, we're focusing on some of the places where Pat spent a large period of time, whether it was Portland or whether it was San Francisco, but there were other places that Pat spent time, including Arizona and West Texas. He went for a tour of Japan, of course, and Florida. What did Pat say about some of these territories where he didn't even spend a whole year there?
I mean, those were not his favorite, that's for sure. I mean, San Francisco, that was where he left his heart, to quote the song. Often enough, the promoter were in some cases minor league, or he was just there for a short period as he was, working an angle out of the San Francisco territory, or when he came to Florida, I mean, he didn't get along with Johnny Valentine, who was the booker, and, Pat was supposed to be helping, but he couldn't do anything or get anything he wanted because, they didn't have the same vision. So those places, I mean, he was never a big fan of. also, coming out of Portland where they had African-American stars going into Texas, where they still had like the different stalls for different colors. That was a very difficult, and Montreal, is not perfect, but, I think we're more Northeast in our vision of things than South. So, I mean, that was left an impression on him, that, and especially as a gay man, that if there could be so much difference for skin color, imagine for his sexual preference. So that was hard. There's not a lot of good memories. I mean, in the books, we glanced through everything, but it's not like there's a lot of story there. And those were not his favorite years, that's for sure.
We've talked a little bit about the great love of his life, his great partnership with his friend Louis. But the other great partnership of his life, a professional one, was of course Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. What did Pat tell you about Ray Stevens?
I mean, he just loved Ray because, Ray was the life of the party. Was always almost too much for Pat. Ray would bring Pat along to get to a girl, and he would end up having Pat with a girl just so that he could get the girl. So that's the type of man Ray was. And also, Pat was perfect in the sense that, if Ray was in a bad shape and they had to go on the road, Pat was the perfect guy to pick him up, get him dressed, and get him in the car so that they could make the town. So they had a fantastic relationship, and I was asked the question about this on the French podcast. So what is the match you would like to see if you could put Pat in his prime in the main event of WrestleMania, and you can do anything you want? And my final answer was Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson one-on-one in their prime at WrestleMania. That'd be the match I want to see, because there's very little out there of them one-on-one in their prime. So I would love to see that, because they were the guys. They were the top workers of their era, and their tag team is so revered today. I mean, I would like to see more of that. And I think in the book we said something that he keeps, when he hears people knocking in hotel's room, that makes him think of that maybe Ray's about to come back. That he may just have been gone for a while. That's a little bit our, he saw things. He wished Ray had still been around, and he regretted a lot. And he didn't have a lot of regret. He regretted not asking for time off to be there for his funeral, because he felt really bad that he missed Ray's funeral. So, I mean, probably his best friend in the business at that point in time.
In 1977, Pat would finally leave San Francisco, leave the Bay Area, leave Roy Schire. Did he ever tell you why he decided that it was time to finally leave?
He never went into details, and his memory was a little bit fuzzy about what happened exactly. He kind of remembered that there was that attempt to put together the money to buy the territory, and because he was basically running it, but he was not making the money of running the territory. More than that, he never went into any kind of details. He has, after years, a lot of more found memories than anything about this. And he actually went back when he was working for, I believe, Vince Sr. I mean, he was brought back for some battle royal and all that. Even if we left on bad terms, Roy knew what was good for business. So, I mean, in wrestling, often enough times heals all wounds. So he thought Roy was a yeller, and that's the thing that he wanted not to be. So that's how I think he's remembered so fondly by talents that he worked with, is that Pat would listen, would offer ideas, would work with their ideas, but he was not a yeller, because he didn't think wrestling was important enough, I believe, or should get you mad enough to start yelling at people. So he didn't want to be like Roy on that level, but he never got into the greedy details. And the more details I was trying to get, usually that's when there was nothing new for him to offer. Either it was too personal, or he didn't want to tarnish any reputation. He just he didn't want his book to be about wrestling stories or wrestling war or wrestling feud between people behind the scene. He wanted it to be about his life and the story of that young kid in Montreal who slept in the closet and ended up sleeping in the biggest hotel in the world. So he just, and in a lot of ways also, I mean, early on, I could see there was an issue with his memory. It was not as bad as it was about to get a few years later, but even there, you know, he would repeat some stuff and you know, go back to some of the same stories. And when he just didn't remember something, there was no way of getting it out of him. It just never happened. So it was there, and it just was never going to get out if it was even possible.
Coming out of San Francisco, Pat would spend 6 months in Florida and then begin a 1.5-year run in the AWA. Let's go now to my conversation with AWA historian George Schire. We continue our look at Pat Patterson's life and career by focusing on his run in the AWA, and of course, joining us to talk about the AWA, a popular guest on the Superpodcast, historian George Schire. George, thanks for being here today.
Brian, it's always a pleasure to talk with you about wrestling, and only sad part is we're talking about those that passed, but always fun.
It is sad to talk about those that passed, but it's important to share the true story about what happened, and a lot of people are interested in knowing about things they didn't know about before, and in this case, so many people think about Pat Patterson in San Francisco or Pat Patterson for the World Wrestling Federation, but Pat had a pretty good little run in the AWA, and we're going to talk about that today. He, of course, would come there at the beginning of 1978 after finishing up his run in Florida. What can you tell me about where the AWA was as a promotion before Pat came in?
Well, it's interesting when you say he came in 78, because if we go back about a year, in early 1977, Ray Stevens, who has long been associated with Pat Patterson, Ray Stevens had been part of the Bobby Heenan family with Nick Bockwinkel, who was the world champion at the time, AWA champion. And Bobby Heenan also had the tag team champions, Lanza and Bobby Duncombe. And here comes Ray Stevens into the family, and he's the only one without a title. And so there was an interesting buildup, because every time Ray would try to interject something in an interview, Bobby would interfere and say, "Just a minute, Ray, I got something I want to add. I was talking about the tag champs or about the singles champ." And when Ray would interject, Nick Bockwinkel would say, "Hold on a minute, Ray, I got something I want to add." And this went on for a while, where Ray Stevens, so you can tell they're going to build a turn here at some point. And Ray is taking the back seat. Well, then they did the famous Manager of the Year segment in 1977. And this was when Bill Apter from the famous Apter magazines, Inside Wrestling, The Wrestler, came into the AWA for All-Star Wrestling, and he was going to present Bobby Heenan with the Manager of the Year trophy. Now, you got to bear in mind, this thing with Ray had been going on for a few weeks, and Ray has just been shut up. So they get into the ring to make the presentation for the trophy. And this, by the way, folks, is on YouTube. You can find this video. It's great, because this is the climax of the previous interviews. Roger Kent, our wrestling announcer in the ring, is getting ready to, along with Bill Apter, to present this trophy to Bobby Heenan. It's a little sidelight. If you look at the video really close, you can see referee George Godasky. As soon as the trophy is presented to Heenan, Godasky nudges Bill Apter, and he kind of nudges him towards the ropes and says, "Get out of the ring." Okay? So Bobby Heenan is exploding about being the Manager of the Year second year in a row, and he's so proud of his tag team champions and his world champion, and Ray is in the ring with all of them. Lanza and Duncombe congratulate him, and then they step out of the ring. And then Nick intervenes and congratulates Bobby. And then when Ray tries to congratulate him, Bobby says, "Ray, don't interrupt me. Take your hands off him." And Ray explodes. He goes nuts. He knocks Bobby down. He hits Nick. He takes the trophy. He breaks it over the ring, over the turnbuckle in the corner, smashes it. And as he does it, he says, this represents my contract with Bobby Heenan. So now Nick is furious because Ray turned on Heenan. He turned on him. Ray Stevens comes out and he says, there's a whole lot of things that are going wrong here that you people don't know about. And for weeks, they've made me feel like an idiot out here. Well, now Ray's the babyface. And you've got to remember that Nick and Ray had been a tag team at that point since 1972. So we got a 5-year together with those two. And it was one of the few times when Nick Bockwinkel challenged a challenger to a match. And he wanted Ray, and Ray said, you got it, I'm going to end your title reign. So Ray did become a babyface. So for 1977, Ray is a babyface, several matches with Nick for the title around the circuit. He had several tag team title matches with Lanza and Duncombe. And Ray teamed with everybody. He teamed with Vern Gagne. He teamed with the Crusher. He teamed with Larry Hennig. He teamed with Billy Robinson. Both Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell, all in attempts to get the title off of the tag champs as well. So here's where it gets kind of interesting. We get to 1978. And of course, for the last year or so, this feud, this program with the Heenan family for Ray Stevens has sort of run its course, as all feuds do. And Pat Patterson is announced as coming to the AWA. Now, the only thing they announced at the time was Pat Patterson is a world-renowned wrestler. He's held many championships, and he's coming into the AWA. It almost didn't happen, though, because Vern Gagne didn't want Pat Patterson to come in with blonde hair. And this was a behind-the-scenes thing that nobody knew at the time. Stevens had the bleach blonde hair. Bobby Heenan had the bleach blonde hair. You had Bobby Duncombe with bleach blonde hair. Everybody had blonde hair, and Vern didn't want another one. So Pat had literally told him, well, if I got to bleach my hair or go back to, brown or whatever his hair color was, he said, I'm not coming in. So Vern backed off and said, fine. Pat Patterson, in the first couple matches that he had, singles matches, he'd get done with his match, and when Ray was wrestling, Pat would come to ringside. Really no connection between the two of them yet. But then when Pat would interfere and Ray would win, that's when the connection was, made. And with no explanation over the past year, and this is what I always found funny, Ray had been a popular babyface now for a year. With no explanation at all, he's all of a sudden with Patterson, and they're wrestling against the good guy tag teams. They were wrestling against the High Flyers. They're wrestling against the Crusher and Igor, and they did something really unique. They brought Rufus R. Jones was in the territory at the time, and they brought in Pat O'Connor, the former NWA champion, and they had him team with Rufus on a couple of cards. They actually referred to a storyline that this is a team that can give Ray and Pat some serious trouble because Rufus and Pat had never been defeated as a tag team. That's the way they were introduced. Now, they didn't say where they had wrestled together or anything, but they had wrestled in St. Louis almost exclusively, off and on, for a long time in the early part of the 70s. And they do hold the distinction of never losing a tag team match, Rufus and Pat in St. Louis. So though they never recognized titles in St. Louis, that is in itself kind of a title. So they had them go against Pat and Ray, and Pat and Ray won the match. And then they're beaten up on all the tag teams, and the time comes for them to be number one contenders to get a chance at Greg and Jim, who had now since then taken the title from Lanza and Duncombe. And the ironic thing happened where Jim Brunzell was playing in a charity softball team tournament here in the Twin Cities, and he actually injured his leg. He ended up with a serious staph infection. He was out of wrestling for a couple months. And during that time frame, they took the old, we're going to take the title off of Greg and Jim because they're not defending it storyline. And because I always want to say Nick and Ray because they were together so long. Pat and Ray were considered to be the logical number one contenders, Stanley Blackburn, in one of his famous edicts, said, by default, and because they are the number one challengers, they are awarded the championship, the AWA title. So that's where Pat and Ray really excelled. And then they acknowledged that they had been a team in the past, that they had held the championship, and it was funny. They said they held the World Tag Team Championship previously, never indicating that it was the NWA version out in San Francisco in the 60s. And they, I think they relied on fans not being able to know or even remember that it wasn't the AWA. But they did acknowledge that they were former tag team champions. So this was going on for a while, and here comes Vern Gagne, and he wants to, along with Billy Robinson, they challenge Nick and Ray for the title. Well, they have a bunch of matches around the circuit, and I got to tell you something. You want to talk about, again, some great matches? Vern, Billy, Pat, Ray, you're talking classics here. I mean, they were good. Well, during the course of their series together, Ray and Pat storyline injure Billy Robinson, put him out of action, and they're bragging about it. We're glad we injured that cockeyed coal miner, as Ray Stevens would say. Got rid of him. So Vern Gagne, he plays the usual, hey, I gotta avenge Billy on this, and this is ridiculous. These guys are running roughshod. They think nobody can control them. And he said, I've realized that what they did to Billy. Well, I'm going to point out that before Billy joined Vern, he had hooked up with Doug Gilbert. Some people would remember him as the Mass Professional out in Atlanta in the 60s. But Doug Gilbert was a great babyface for years, and he had returned. And him and Billy had started out as a team, and then Billy teamed with Vern to get a better partner, so to speak. So Billy's injured, and Vern says, I got to find myself a partner that can fight like they do, because obviously they don't pay attention to the rules. And I'm going to find that partner. Well, that starts the fans guessing. That's a good, way to work the fans. Well, a week later, he comes up with the shocker of shockers. He's convinced Mad Dog Vachon to join him. And, this is classic because Vern and Dog, for the past decade and a half, have been mortal enemies and had many, many classic battles over the title, everything. And then the fans are saying, can the Dog be trusted? Can Vern trust Mad Dog? Is he going to turn on him? Is Vern going to be in the ring with 3 enemies instead of 2? I mean, it's a classic tag team encounter. But Vern and Dog, they come up with the idea saying, I don't like you and you don't like me, but we don't like Ray and Pat more, so we're going to work together. And that's what they said on their interviews. And, of course, Pat and Ray, they're saying they're not going to get along. They're not taking it seriously. Well, Vern and the Dog end up, getting the title from Pat and Ray. I'd also point out that during this time frame, the AWA is promoting out in California, in San Francisco. And tell me when I say Nick, hit me, would you? Pat and Ray are out there, and when they wrestle out there, they're baby faces. And they're going against guys like Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis or some of the other heels. And Patera was out there. But when they're in the AWA proper, then they're wrestling against the baby faces because they're the heels. So that was a unique situation. But they held the title until they lost it to Vern and Dog. And then pretty much after that, they had some matches with Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis. And here in the proper AWA, and of course, in that match, we had 2 heel teams against each other. It was one of those where one guy hits the other guy, we cheer. They hit the other team, we cheer. Just both destroy each other. But Ray and Pat were together then until 1979, the very early 1980. And then Pat was moving on to the WWF at that time. And he ended up winning that phantom fictitious Intercontinental title in Rio de Janeiro. Came in as the first IC champion. So that was kind of his run in the AWA. He very seldom wrestled Pat, very seldom wrestled in singles matches. after the initial coming into the territory, and he and Ray remained a team, and a very potent one. There's another video of them on YouTube where they're introduced on TV, All-Star Wrestling, and they're going to wrestle against Frankie Hill, and Frankie Hill's partner is not there, and they don't know where he is, and they got to get the match going. So out of the locker room comes Billy Robinson. So they're going to have a protest there because they're not bringing in Robinson to wrestle. And Frankie Hill, for those that don't know, went on to the WWF as Jewel Strongbow, Jay Strongbow's wrestling Indian brother.
Well, a couple questions for you, and one of them would be about something you brought up, which was Ray and Pat wrestling as a tag team as baby faces in Northern California. Now, this was an interesting period of time because Roy Schire began to shut down, and right around the same time, Vern Gagne decided he wanted to start running shows in Northern California. What can you tell me about the AWA's expansion to California at that point in time, and also how important were Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson to his success in Northern California?
I think they were vitally important because Vern hadn't been in the Northern California for, before this. And in order to go in there, and like you say, Roy Schire, who obviously, let's go back and point out that Roy Schire had a great connection for almost 2 decades with Ray and Pat, because Pat Patterson had been out in California. He held their tag team title, Roy Shire's tag team title, something like 19 different times with various partners, including Ray Stevens. And then Ray was out there for, you go back to the 60s, the entire decade of the 60s, Ray Stevens was box office god out there in San Francisco. So, and he had turned baby at that point later on, and that's the cycle. Most great heels eventually turn baby. And Ray was as popular as anybody in San Francisco. So when Vern wanted to go in there, and Roy was already struggling, Roy Schire. Roy Schire was a brother to Ray, by the way, fictitiously when Ray was Ray Schire back in the early 60s. That's how they connected. But Roy Schire was folding down. So it was very important that if you had Ray and Pat on the card, it was going to generate the audience, at least the audience that remembered them from the Cow Palace days and everything. And obviously, because they had both turned babyface in San Francisco years before, they had to be a babyface, and that's why they would wrestle against the heels. I've got one match where they actually wrestled against Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis, and Ray and Pat were the babies. But yeah, I think it was very important, Brian. Without them, I don't know that it would have been as successful. And Vern wasn't in San Francisco for that long of a time, because as we moved further into the 80s, that's when things started to fall apart all over the country. As we got to 1984, when McMahon started his expansion and the raiding of territories, and especially the AWA. So it was a short run.
Well, of course, you got to see a lot of great tag teams, and specifically you got to see Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel, and that was the tag team maybe of the 70s for a lot of people. Ray and Pat may have been the tag team of the 60s for people, especially in San Francisco, but so many people talk about Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel. You finally got to see Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, legendary tag team from the 60s, at the end of the decade in the AWA. What is the legacy Pat Patterson leaves behind in the AWA? What can you tell me about what he meant to that period of time?
I think what he meant to that period of time was that he probably joining Ray again and starting that tag team over, because it was interesting. In the 60s, I'm in the AWA, and I will always talk about how great the tag team of Larry Hennig and Harley Race were for the 60s for the AWA. But at the same time period, you had out in San Francisco, Stevens and Patterson, who were, if you picked up any wrestling magazine, those were the 2 tag teams that were prominently in all the ratings and talked about. So when Pat came to the AWA, I had never seen him with Ray Stevens, and I was excited about that. I will tell you, and this is just a personal opinion, I was sad that I got to see both of them when they were a little bit later in their careers as they were. And Ray was, I think, what was he, like 4 or 5 years older than Pat? Something like that. I'd have to look that one up. But they were older. When I personally compare Stevens and Patterson to Stevens and Bockwinkel, I like the Bockwinkel partnership better. I think their matches were better. And of course, you got to remember that's 5 years earlier when they started together. But it was great to see Ray and Pat, and they definitely had their greatest gimmick was that because they were blonde, and this is why it was foolish for Vern to ever suggest that Pat doesn't come in with blonde hair. Their greatest gimmick was that they looked enough alike, and they would dress alike. I mean, the same trunks and boots and that sort of thing. And they had that gimmick down where they could change places, and the referee would play dumb and not notice that they had done it. But the fans would see it. And of course, then they're screaming at the ref. So that was a great way to work the crowd. They wouldn't have been able to pull it off with two different hair colors. So that, and I don't know if they did that in San Francisco previously. I'm guessing they may have. But it was a great way to work the crowd because they could switch places. One could get knocked out of the ring and the other one would get in and the ref would, not see it, which is great because you always have to have a great blind referee in a match to make it good. And so, yeah, that's my comparison. I think that's what Pat brought to the AWA. He completed Ray Stevens' story. And I will point out that, because Ray was suddenly a heel again with really no explanation and no mention of his being a babyface for a year, he had now rejoined the Bobby Heenan family because Ray and Pat and Nick were working 6-man matches together, and Bobby Heenan was managing them. And it just seemed like the feud between Heenan and Stevens never happened, and there was no mention of it. Except, those of us that were cognizant and sober, we remembered it.
Coming out of the AWA, Pat Patterson would then go to the World Wrestling Federation, where he famously had 4 Madison Square Garden main events against Bob Backlund, beginning a pretty legendary run as a wrestler, then a commentator, and of course a creative executive for Vince McMahon Jr.'s World Wrestling Federation. Bertrand, what did Pat tell you about going to the WWF for the first time, and what were his impressions? What were his aspirations going to the Northeast?
I mean, he was surprised because he did not expect the big guy territory to call him. He was a draw. He was a proven draw, but he was a small guy for compared to the Land of Giants. But he had met Vince Sr. at an NWA convention that Schire had brought him to. And, Pat being Pat, he was not always at the wrestling meeting. So often enough, he was at the bar entertaining the wives of the different promoters. And he got himself over with Vince's wife. And she felt, that he was just not like any of the other wrestler, that he was someone that she could socialize with, and that was different from the other wrestlers. So, that's how that relationship started. And he wanted Vern Gagne to tell him, okay, what are we going to be doing? And Vern told him, well, I don't tell my secret. I'm the promoter, so you do whatever I say. And Ray was more easygoing on this, So, and for Pat, basically, Minnesota was redoing what they've already done in San Francisco. So he told Vern, well, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to be doing, which was that he had that offer from New York in his pocket, and he decided to go for it. Also, that would bring him closer to Montreal. And he had not seen his family on a regular basis. He had to basically do red-eye flight just to be there for his mother's funeral, which he was very close to. So for him, being back close to home was also a very important part of the process of going to New York.
What did he tell you about Vince McMahon Jr.? Of course, they would grow to be very close. He would grow to be close with Vince's entire family, but at first, he was the son of the promoter and the commentator when Pat would start doing commentary. They were partners on commentary. What did he tell you about the early years of his relationship with Vince McMahon Jr.?
I mean, they got along almost right from the start, and they would develop more almost of a brotherly relationship than just co-worker or anything like that. And you have to understand that the bond is very deep, is that on his deathbed, Vince Sr. asked Pat to take care of Andre and take care of his son. So for Pat, loyalty was foremost, and he was loyal to Vince to the end. So that's the type of relationship they built right from the start, and later on. And I don't want to get us too ahead in the story, but they had a great relationship from the start, and Pat understood who would end up being the owner in this and who was going to be the final decision maker. And he was never going to be the one dying on an idea to get it over if it was not going to work. So that's also an important lesson, I think, in wrestling. And I mean, to the last few years when he talked about Vince, it was very fondly. He could not believe Vince was still working because he was tired himself and he didn't want to travel all the time and he didn't want to work all the time. But he was always amazed how Vince also was very loyal to him. As when they were going to television in the last few years, I mean, Pat was always going to fly with Vince on the private plane. And sometimes Pat would feel bad because you have people working hard for you and they're in the mix of thing now and I don't do anything. And he said, Pat, you should be there. If you would not be there, it would not be normal. And I remember early on when we started on the book, the first year or so, I would know when Pat was at TV and he would tell me, oh, Vince tell me that just me being there makes a difference. And I could follow the show. And when Pat was there, we had better show than when Pat was not there. So I thought that was, and maybe that explained the whole pandemic stories that we're getting because he didn't go to any of those shows. So it's like, he was very special and he had a way of communicating with Vince and understanding what Vince wanted and presenting new stories to Vince so that Vince would consider something. And I think that is a very special talent. And I think it's J.J. Dillon who's said that there's a lot of credit to give to Pat Patterson for the WWE success. And I think that's true.
When it comes to Pat in the ring for the World Wrestling Federation, a lot of fans may remember him and Ted DiBiase first for the North American title, and then Pat, of course, becoming the first Intercontinental Champion. Of course, Pat and Ken Patera, we mentioned before the 4 matches against Bob Backlund. Later on, there was a feud with Angelo King Kong Mosca, but the one people still talk about to this day, the match that people still watch, was the alley fight, Madison Square Garden, Sergeant Slaughter versus Pat Patterson, all set up with that big angle on TV, the Cobra Clutch Challenge. What did Pat tell you about that match with Sergeant Slaughter, and what did he think of Sergeant Slaughter?
He was a very good friend with Slaughter. I mean, he's the one who got him into the WWE. He knew him, I believe, from the AWA or something like that. And, he was starting to get over in the South. And, he's the one who put in the words. I mean, there's a lot of unsaid in this, but, when all the AWA guys came to New York, I mean, the conduit was Pat. That there's no doubt. And the same, a lot of the people that came in, Pat knew of some way, shape, or form, even later on, from working Florida or working San Francisco or working Portland, working Minnesota. He was the conduit in getting a lot of those guys on board and a lot of those guys jumping to New York. So that because wrestling, especially in those days, worked a lot on, word and being confident that you were going to get a good chance to shine, or a fair shot. And people believe in Pat's word. Pat's word was gold, So it was, he loved that match as one of his favorite. I mean, I think he loved the concept and the feud with Backlund of being the only one having 4 main events in a row at the Garden. But the match that he loved and remember and was most proud of was the alley fight, obviously.
When the World Wrestling Federation would finally start airing in Montreal, Pat was on TV. And really, when you think about it, for the most part, Pat, despite growing up in Montreal, didn't spend a lot of time there as a professional wrestler. What was that like? And I'm asking you actually personally as a fan from that period of time, Bertrand, in the 80s, when all of a sudden Pat Patterson was on TV in Montreal.
I mean, he had come in from New York once he was based in New York in 1980, 1981, 1983. He had good run here with Ray Rougeau. He turned heel, and he had that amazing gimmick of being Le Rêve du Québec, the dream of the province of Quebec, because he had changed his name to an English name. He had become a big star in the United States of America, and he was now bigger, better than any Quebecers. That was his gimmick. And to this day, people remembers that. I mean, he would tell me, I was in Texas, and I'm at the hotel, and I'm waiting for a cab, and this guy comes up to me and starts speaking French to me. You're that maudit French Grève du Québec. And he would be so happy. People 20, 30 years later, I mean, they would still remember that character from that was on TV a couple of years in the early 80s. So when the WWE took over, I mean, obviously he was put on the French show because he already had a good name in Montreal. He could speak French, and they developed that Piper's Pit version called the Brunch with Pat in French, where he would interview all the wrestlers, and the wrestler would give real answer to his question, and then he would translate in French and say the most obnoxious thing possible that had nothing to do with the answer. So I mean. The wrestler would look at him funny, saying, "I'm not sure you're translating." And so there's a bunch of funny clip of him doing that and having a lot of fun with it. So that when I produced that segment with him, I mean, we had a lot of fun with it, and we had to play around to find the timing of it, but we ended up doing something that was very close to that concept. So he was really it. I remember I hated Pat Patterson as a kid. I was like, he was so obnoxious, but I remember also that with my eyes of today, he was an amazing worker, bumping and doing things that the other guys not necessarily did. And I remember, there's a big show at one point at the Forum where there's 4 main events. So there's the Rougeau match is the main event, the Bravo match is the main event, the Martel match is the main event. Everybody is getting their billed as the main event. But the last match of the night is the match with Patterson and the Rougeau because, well, obviously nobody wanted to follow them up. And, I remember that match as being the best match of the night, even though I also remember being surprised that Bravo was not the last match. But now with my eyes of today, I see why they put him there and also why we ended up working with Bravo and Martel in the main events because he was so good. Imagine being a up-and-comer and having the chance to work with Pat Patterson in his prime, or at least close to his prime. And I consider myself privileged to have seen those live, especially that time period that he was here. That's the time period where there's less footage of international wrestling available. So, he was just an amazing character and an amazing worker.
Pat is always someone who had a lot of ideas, and of course he worked for someone who, although abrasive, was considered a booking genius in Roy Schire. Under Vince McMahon, Pat would finally get to have his creative visions fulfilled, although it wasn't always easy. Of course, he came up with the Royal Rumble, he came up with a lot of the big finishes, the big matches that people remember. How much did it mean to Pat to finally be in a position where, I don't know if booker is the right term because really Vince McMahon was his own booker, but Pat was the one who was the creative lead on so many things during the biggest period of business for the World Wrestling Federation. Talk a little bit about Pat as a creative executive, Pat as an agent for wrestlers, giving them the finishes. How much did he enjoy that?
He loved being the teacher. He loved being able to transmit his knowledge and make them understand. But, he was funny in that manner, is that he would look at you funny when you would say Booker or stories. And it was like, you don't know what you're talking about type look. So I mean, and he didn't like to go into the details, and also there was a lot of blanks in there. I'm afraid, but it's like for him it was work, eh? So we can all relate to the fact that sometimes we don't remember what we did at work last week. So in Pat's case, I mean, he got burned out a few times working for Vince, where he quit or asked to retire, but Vince always managed to find a way to bring him back. And the last time he promised him, to let him go home whenever he wanted, but that to at least keep him on the payroll and keep him working as much as Pat wanted to work. So for Pat, it was never something that, we watched it and we lived it, and we have so great memories of some of the stuff he did. But for him, it was different. He has a few good stories. Like, he loved the WrestleMania 6 main event because he saw his total vision of the main event come to life in front of such a large crowd. So that he loved. And he loved the real emotion that the Warrior had after the match about the way everything ended up planning as they had prepared. But those stories are very, there was not a lot of those. And I'm sorry, I tried. If it's not in the book, believe me, I asked about it. And he just didn't have anything to say about it. He didn't remember. In some maybe cases, he didn't want to really talk about that. But it never felt really like that, more or less. Like, I don't remember enough to tell you anything. and for him, that was just normal. I mean, I don't remember what I did last week at work, or what I even less what I did 14 years ago at my other job, So it's there was a lot of that because for Pat, it's not like he was keeping notes of what he was doing, or remembering things or keeping mementos or anything like that. I think when we did the book, we had a bunch of whole albums, and those were all Louis. Louis had put those together. So thank you, Louis. And so there was Boston, Portland, up until the early days in New York when he was a talent. And it was all Louis taking pictures and putting them into albums and taking times to put that together for him and them. He was never big on, so after Louis was gone, there was barely anything. And in the time he was an executive, there was barely any pictures. So, I mean, it just became work. And so in a sense, that's what explained his longevity. But at the same time, you would have loved him to have I love the Yoda comparison for Pat. You would have loved him to be able to tell, I was sitting in the dressing room, and then I had Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, and I told Shawn this, and I told Bret this. He didn't remember things in that manner, or he never verbalized them in this manner. For him, it was the memory of the match, of the emotion he felt when he saw the match. That's what he remembered.
How much pride did Pat take in developing the Royal Rumble?
As year went by and he saw the success of the show, he was very happy about it. And he loved the fact that Vince didn't like the idea at the top. And, he loved telling the story of Vince telling Ebersol, well, Pat, tell him about your stupid idea. And he loved saying, well, first off, Vince, it's not a stupid idea. And then he would put the idea over how he pitched it to Ebersol, and all. Ebersol thought it was great. And then they put Pat in charge of putting the first Royal Rumble together. So, I mean, and as the years went by, with now the Rumble being in the stadium and all that, he was just mind blown by how popular the event became. And, I don't think he realized how, that's going to make him immortal. I mean, every year at the Royal Rumble, they're going to somehow mention Pat Patterson. And I'm hoping they're going to do something special, anything, to make it part of the show somehow. So he took a lot of pride in it because he saw how much people loved the match, and it was his idea to begin with. And he got the credit for it, as he would say.
Well, Bertrand, one of the things we have to talk about are the WWE sex scandals of the early 1990s, because Pat certainly got swept up in it, where for a time he resigned from the World Wrestling Federation. And what had happened, and feel free to jump in or correct me where I'm wrong, but there were accusations made, credible accusations, against Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin, leading to both men being fired from the World Wrestling Federation. Now, Terry Garvin was an actual executive there. Mel Phillips was, I believe, technically an independent contractor, but he was the ring announcer on a lot of shows. He did a lot of different jobs for the World Wrestling Federation. Pat ended up getting accused also by someone named Murray Hodgson, who it would turn out was a con artist. And unfortunately, Pat got swept up in the scandals to the point where I think there's some confusion today when people talk about that period of time and they say, oh, it was Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin and Pat Patterson because he did leave for a period of time there. What can you tell us about that period? Early 1992, the WWF sex scandals, and what did Pat tell you about that period of time? Did he think it was just persecution because he was a gay man? What were Pat's thoughts? And again, let's clear the air because I think there are a lot of fans out there who don't know the whole story.
I believe so too. And often enough, when something is exposed, people always remember what happened when it was told. But if after that somebody gets cleared or somebody comes up in his own book and say, oh, I lied about Pat Patterson, well, that get like 10 page in the newspaper and not front page. So, for Pat, that was a subject I wanted to approach, and it took quite a while before I got there, as this was a very touchy subject. That's not something he loved to talk about, obviously. For him, that's the worst time of his life. And, I had to make the whole pitch to him about it. This is your book. If you don't talk about it, people are going to say, you're avoiding. So therefore, you're guilty. And, to him, it was like, the less I talk about it, the better, because no matter what I say, people are going to do what they do and just remember the accusation and not the retraction and his name being cleared of everything, actually. So he finally went on and talked about it. And that's the only time he cried. And he was very vulnerable talking about it. How much Louis was disgusted with the whole situation and how much Louis backed him up because he knew what kind of a man he was. But at the same time, as he had promised Senior, he was going to be loyal to his son. And if his presence was going to be what was turning out to be with that whole thing, his reaction was that he needed to resign out of the loyalty to the company. But at the same time, the same loyalty was on the other side, and they did hire a private investigation firm to talk to everyone at the office, and they cleared Pat of anything. Pat was so popular. The phrase they use is that you could run for president, and I haven't met anyone traveling with Pat who would not just jump in Pat's arm to hug him. Paul Orndorff comes to mind. Sometimes he would he's in a convention and he's like rah rah rah, and he's very, grumpy. And then Pat shows up, and it's like he's a new man. Oh, Pat, and everybody loved Pat. And so there was one man who threw him under the bus, and that person told a lie and told afterwards in his biography that it was a lie. And, the whole Murray thing was cleared, and we go into details on Pat's perception of that situation. And it was so hard to him because he was gay, yes, but he never touched anyone. And there never was any kind of criminal investigation. There was never any criminal charges. And except for the lies that were proven as lie, there's never been any other, testimony of anything. Was Pat grumpy and a little bit raunchy in his jokes? Yes, he is. He's a man of his time. He was born in the 40s. He wasn't born in 2020. But never have I seen Pat do anything wrong. And, that night, was very emotional because I could see how hard it is. And he never spoke about it afterwards. And I was very happy also because the story in the book is what Pat approved. That's what Pat said. And WWE didn't change one comma in the whole thing or nothing. They said if it's Pat's story, that's good for us. There's nothing wrong legally in the way it's presented. It can run as it is. And that was it, because he didn't want to dwell on it, because in his mind he was never going to change the mind of people who didn't want to believe that he had been cleared of everything. And he was lumped into the Terry Garvin Mel Phillip pot. And after that, that announcer guy jumped in, tried to get a payday. And after the smoke cleared and Pat was cleared of any charges, and that there was never any criminal investigation of any kind, and nobody ever came out after that saying that Pat did anything wrong, it's still out there somehow, and people keep repeating it without real knowledge of the situation. So, I'm never going to shy away from it. The man I knew was a great person, and he was amazing. And before meeting him, you ask yourself those questions. That's why that's one of the subjects I wanted to talk about, because I had gravitated in the indie world of the province of Quebec, and the number of wrestlers who told the story that, well, I didn't get a job because I didn't play on Pat Patterson's team. Well, I got a job and I didn't play on his team either. So I think, it was used by a lot of people as a crutches. Well, Pat is gay, I'm not gay, so that's why I'm not getting work, or that's why WWE doesn't want me. I think those stories ended up giving him a really bad reputation that was not deserved at all. And I'm so happy in the last few years, especially with the guys like Edge and Christian and Landstorm and Chris Jericho and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, who had all positive things to say through John Cena, of working with him through Dwayne Johnson, which sometimes we forget that without Pat, there's no Dwayne Johnson. They all were so positive. So, they reverse a little bit of the damage, but, it's still there. And I just hope that, shows like today and people actually going out and reading what's in the book, and doing a little bit of studying of the situation, will realize that, Pat got a bad deal on this, and he just took it because he was loyal to the company and loyal to Vince, because that's what he had promised his dad.
Well, like you said, there's a big difference between someone being raunchy and saying raunchy things out loud in a bar or with friends, and someone saying, if you don't sleep with me, you don't have a job. Two completely different things, and of course the latter was never shown to be the case. I have to ask you, though, on this topic, Bertrand, Pat Patterson knew Billy Graham since San Francisco. They were partners. Did he ever forgive Billy Graham? Could he ever have forgiven Billy Graham for really being out there and being one of the most vocal people accusing Pat Patterson, and then later on admitting that it wasn't true?
Pat would not want me to say anything good or bad about Billy Graham. He just doesn't exist for Pat.
I guess that answers the question right there. Of course, a few years later, something else would happen that was pretty tragic for Pat, and that was the loss of Louis. What was that period of time like for him?
It was hard. He was the love of his life. That may sound cliche, but that's just what it is. And, WWE being what it is, it was like, well, you should go back to work. Don't stay alone. That'll get your mind off. But it took a long, long time for him to get over it, because his pattern was like, go to the show, do the show, go to the bar, have a drink with the boys, go back to the room, call Louis. And the first few times he was back on the road afterwards, he would go back to the room and he would pick up the phone. and then realized that there was nobody to call. So that was hard for a long, long time for him. And he loved the story when Mick Foley came to him and asked him, because Louis actually died the day of the Hell in the Cell at King of the Ring, where Mick Foley was thrown off the cage. And years later, Mick asked him if Louis had died because he saw Mick being thrown off the cage. So that made Pat laugh, because actually Louis passed away in the afternoon, and that was a way for him to see it in a different light and see it with more not laughter. It's not the word I'm looking for. More of a to accept the fact that that this was the past and that he had to move forward. And he was talking about Louis, up until the last time I spoke to him. And, there was there's a picture of it in the book. I wish I had took a better picture of it, actually, because I don't like that picture. I just took it like that, and it ended up in the book, because when I told the story of that, he had that one frame of Louis in his home, that one picture. The publisher, they wanted that picture in the book, but I didn't like the picture. But it's in there, and it meant the world to him, that little tiny picture in the golf frame with golf clubs, because they love to play golf. So he was, 40 years with someone. That's, to me, amazing. And he went on over 20 years without him. And he never stopped loving him and never stopped thinking about him. And, in all of this, in the past 2 days, thinking that they may just be together again, that made me smile.
Bertrand, before we wrap things up today, I have to ask you about something that a lot of younger fans may best remember Pat Patterson for, which is his renaissance, as it were, on TV as an on-air performer, one of the Stooges for Vince McMahon, when Vince McMahon became a heel character on TV. Did Pat enjoy that? Did Pat enjoy working with Gerald Briscoe and being an on-air character as one of the Stooges?
More or less would be the best answer. We went through it a little bit in the book. It's like, I was a main event guy. Now I was a comedy guy. So, he wished if he was gonna work with Stone Cold, he wanted to work the main event and then for the championship, for the best money on the card. He didn't want necessarily to work the Mean Street Posse, which was one thing he was scared about, is that he could still go, obviously. He was amazing, but he didn't want to get hurt at this point, so he was a little bit careful. So, Briscoe, Jerry had a lot more fun than he did, and I think with the years, it kind of became their thing. Like, Briscoe would be the one who loved it, and he would be the one who would be saying, rah, 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 rah. So it kind of became their shtick a little bit, I think, and Pat kind of liked the concept of putting all the heat on Jerry for this. So it's it's beautiful, because when you look at it, it's amazing. You said, well, this guy's been retired for over 10 years and he's coming in and he's better than a lot of the guys. But, at the same time, for Pat, it was, that's not what he wanted to be remembered for, basically. But, he still did the 24/7 thing recently, even though, he didn't do anything physically, he still did it, because that was performing. That was, what he loved to do. So he may go backward and grumpy and grudgingly, but, he still liked to perform. So, he kind of liked it, I guess. But, he was never going to sell the fact that he kind of liked it.
Well, Bertrand, this has been tremendous, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us today to talk about your friend, Pat Patterson. And as we begin to wrap things up, what do you see as Pat's biggest legacy that he leaves behind on the world of professional wrestling?
Well, I the Royal Rumble, has to be at the top, I guess. There's no other way around. That's going to be around as long as there's going to be a WWE. In the book, we talk about it. He had that idea that he wanted them to create the Patterson Cup, like the Stanley Cup for the Rumble, where, they could drink champagne in the end in it, and they would have the big ring with all the names on it, and they could sell replica, and people would take pictures with the trophy at WrestleMania week, and that whole idea. So I hope they do, maybe not that, but they do something that will make Pat part of the Rumble every year somehow. And then, the legacy is how many people he put in the spotlight as a producer and behind the scene power player. From Bret Hart to even, he was a big supporter of Roman Reigns, to, John Cena, to Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Dwayne Johnson, Daniel Bryan, Rey Mysterio, those guys, all owe something to Pat. And even a story I didn't know, Sami Zayn came out that, how much Pat was a big supporter of him in NXT, in getting him the big push that made him at the time. So Pat was like that. When he liked you, he really did, and he would get behind. And that was sad in the last few years, because the last time I saw him, his new favorite wrestler was Chad Gable. And he had those ideas, and he'd be amazing, and he should do the Yvon Robert hold, and I could teach him, and that'd be perfect for his character. And he had all those ideas, but he didn't have the will to go and fight for those ideas anymore. And, he just let it go. And, personally, I felt even sadder, because I think there was really something in Chad Gable to see, the way what they did was the opposite of what Pat had in mind for Chad Gable. So that's the legacy, I think, what he would bring to the show, and the way of thinking that Pat had. No one had that. No one. And that will be missed. He's the last one of those giants, those Roy Schire, Eddie Graham. Pat was the last one, and now he's gone, and there's no one of that stature left.
I want to remind everyone you can pick up a copy of the book that Bertrand wrote with Pat Patterson, Accepted, How the First Gay Superstar Changed WWE, out on ECW Press, available wherever you get your favorite books. But until next time, the 605 Super Podcast is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. Big thanks to Lou Kippelman and Jace Nacarado for their help in putting this episode together. But for Bertrand Hebert, I'm the great Brian Last. Tally-ho! We are now going to feature some classic audio from National All-Star Wrestling, aka Wrestling in San Francisco, promoted by Roy Schire. These are clips that originally aired on KTVU Channel 2 out of Oakland, California. These clips are originally from the collection of Les Puskas, and I want to give a big special thanks to his son, Clay Puskas, for supplying them to the Super Podcast here today. Now, a reminder, these are old clips. These are classic clips from the 60s. The audio is clearly not perfect, but due to the historical nature of these audio clips, we thought it was important to play them today to give you a small example of what it was like when Pat Patterson wrestled in San Francisco with Ray Stevens and eventually against Ray Stevens. This first series of clips is from 1966, and this first clip is regarding the April 16th, 1966 match at the Cow Palace, a tag team title match against Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright.
Walt Harris back here once again. Tell me what to say. Don't tell me what to do. I'm not telling you anything. If you'll wait a minute, I'll talk to you. Listen, Ray and I are going to come over here and say anything we want, and as long as we want to. I got something to say first. This vicious display of wrestling tonight looked like sheer desperation on your part, frightened desperation, because you know what's in store for you Saturday night, April the 16th. Listen, what you just saw tonight was the world's tag team champions using great skill and ability, the big piece to look better than most of you pencil necks do. From any direction, if you're looking at me, I look better than any of you pencil necks do around here. Oh, I got news for you. I think after Saturday, April the 16th, you'll look even better because I think Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright will rearrange your looks a little bit. Why don't you tell these people to be quiet when we're talking? And why don't you just stand there and talk like a gentleman and quit making derogatory remarks about us? Because when we get in there with Bearcat Wright and Bobo Brazil, now there's two real names, two good names, Bearcat Wright and Bobo Brazil. And who they got a match against? The World Tag Team Champions, Pat Patterson and myself. Now, you can't honestly stand there and think that these two men have the class and the intelligence to wrestle two great wrestlers like Pat and myself. Matter of fact, I think they have. And I think Bobo Brazil, if he ever gives you the cocoa bump, he'll split you wide open. If he gets in the ring with us, if he doesn't chicken out before the match, he'll be doing a great thing. If he even gets in the ring, that's a big word. If. He'll be there, and he'll be ready for you. Like I said, you can't really think that these guys are in a class with Patterson and myself. Sure, Bobo Brazil has got a hard head, but he should have a hard head because he hasn't got anything between this ear and this ear except a lot of bone. So when you get a lot of bone up there, naturally you got to have a hard head, don't you? Well, what have you got up there? Listen, I got brains. Sure, my head's not as hard as his, but I don't expect it to be because my head's full of brains. And Pat and I are great thinkers. Not only great wrestlers, but great thinkers when we're in the ring. That's why we're the World Tag Team Champions. And Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright are not the champions, and a lot of these other guys are not the champions. You think you can handle Bobo Brazil? Do you think you can beat Bearcat Wright? Listen, you know you shouldn't ask me questions like that. Everybody knows I can beat Bearcat Wright. He's nothing but a tall, wet noodle. He's a big, tall guy. He's a big giant, but he's got a head about that big. No brain, just like Bobo Brazil. When did you ever beat Bearcat Wright? Well, listen, that's beside the point. I'm just talking about the match coming up next Saturday night. Well, listen to me. We got something stuck in our tights, and we got something stuck in our brain. What we gonna do to these two guys? Listen, like Ray said, they don't have any brains at all. And I'll bet you anything, we'll wrestle with these guys for 1 hour, and they couldn't beat us at all. How can they beat us with a no-time limit? You didn't beat them in 1 hour either, let me remind you. Exactly the reason why we didn't beat him. Pat and I are in such great shape that hour went by so fast that we didn't even realize it. We thought that only maybe 10 or 15 minutes that went by in the match. I don't know, maybe the timekeeper went crazy or something. But we were in such great shape that we didn't even realize that the hour went by, and we were just getting ready to polish him off when that bell rang. That's exactly why they lasted an hour with us. You see, number one, we have a great psychological advantage over these two guys because we're the champions, and they know that we're mean and we're tough, and we'll break their leg, their arm, or their finger, anything we can get when we get a hold of them. So therefore, they're scared. They're scared, number one, because we're the champions. When they walk in that ring, you can see the sweat rolling off of them, and their knees are shaking like the leaves on a tree in a windstorm when they come in there. So they're scared. That's why we have a big advantage over them. Now, you're still sounding like you're whistling by the graveyard, and you will be until next Saturday night, and then we'll see just what happens in that ring. Let's face it, Ray and I were the World Tag Team Champion, and we belong there. Let's face it, just like this. Would you see Bearcat Wright and Bobo Brazil World Tag Team Champions? Great. What kind of class would they show to the wrestling? Anything. They can't even talk. They don't know how to dress properly or anything. You got to have class. You got to just naturally have class to be a champion in anything. They got it. They'll stand up here and they'll face the camera. They won't turn their back to it. They're not ashamed of the way they act. Just because they're scared to turn away. I don't know anybody out there, nothing. I'll turn my back on anybody I want to, including you, and I'm tired of your derogatory remarks here tonight. I'd let you have enough of my valuable time and enough of yours his valuable time. We're not talking anymore to you. Come on, Pat. Goodbye.
The World Tag Team Champions Patterson and Stevens would end up winning that match when Bobo Brazil was injured in the third fall and could not continue in the match. This next clip is regarding a 6-man tag match with Patterson and Stevens with Cyclone Negro against Luis Hernandez, Louis Martinez, and Jim Haiti.
We're going to talk now to Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. That shows you how stupid Louis Martinez is. Listen, he's telling you and he's telling everybody around here what he's going to do with his partner. He's going to give a signal in French. Well, that shows you how stupid and ignorant he is because I speak French. I can understand what he's going to say. Also, you speak French. What good's it going to do you? Stevens doesn't speak French. Cyclone Negro doesn't speak French. I'll tell you what. I'm going to show, I have 1 week to show Ray how to speak French, and I'm going to show Cyclone Negro how to speak French. Now Cyclone Negro speaks English. Well, if he speaks English, he can speak French. And it took him over a year to learn English. He just learned how to handle that language. How could he learn to handle another one in a week's time? Negro and I don't need a week. I can learn how to speak French if I make my mind up. I can learn how to speak it in 2 days fluently. But that's beside the point. I don't think that we're going to have to learn how to speak French fluently or any other language. And I'm glad to hear that these Mexican wrestlers and that Jim Haiti is learning a couple or 3 other languages because they're going to need 2 or 3 languages. They better say prayers in all of them if they know. They won't have to worry about that. But I'll tell you one thing, there's 2 referees going to kind of crimp your style. Now wait just a minute. We protested those 2 referees. And you see how those 2 little Mexicans are? We give them the opportunity to wrestle us. That shows you what great sports we are. We give them the opportunity to have a match with us. Now they go crying around and get this promoter, this Roy Schire, and the 3 of them went like thieves in the dark to the Alliance, and they got another referee. Now, I tell you what I think. I think that the Schire is trying to get us beat. Maybe by these guys or whoever he can. I think this is the best way that he can see is to get another referee in there to babysit for these 3 guys. I don't think the question is trying to get you beat. It just means that when you are beat, there'll be 1 referee available at all times to see that you're beat. Well, I'm telling you right now, we're not planning on being beat. Like these guys, you heard that Martinez and what's the other guy's name? Hernandez. You heard him talking about somebody's always getting hurt. Well, that just shows you how scared they are. They're thinking about getting hurt. They're thinking about one of us breaking their arm or breaking their leg even before we get in there. And that's just exactly what we're going to do to you. I hope he's watching right now. We're going to break his arm or their leg or anything that we can break on him. You're going to try, but Jim Haiti is a tough customer, and he's just the kind of man they need in their corner. I'm glad you brought this Jim Haiti's name up. I don't know where did they give him the name Gentleman Jim? Can you tell me where they give him a name like that? Or where's the style he has in the ring? Listen, we've seen this guy wrestle all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast and overseas and every place else. Now this guy goes out and breaks the rules just like anybody else. In fact, he breaks them first and breaks them more than other people. So I don't know where he gets the name of Gentleman Jim Haiti at. Well, maybe he won't be a gentleman against you 2, against you 3, I should say, along with Cyclone Negro. You took so long to win this bout tonight, we've had to cancel the 3rd bout. We haven't got time for them to wrestle. Listen, these 2 guys were tough guys. These are just as tough of guys as anybody we've ever wrestled any place. Now, what do you mean take long? 17 and a half minutes. I'll tell you one thing, if they're tough, Hernandez and Martinez are going to really be giants against you along with their partner Jim Haiti. I'm going to tell you something else too. Usually, I've made predictions. I've told guys they better have an ambulance and stretchers out there when we get through with them. And 9 times out of 10, when I say that, I'm absolutely right. This time, this promoter, Roy Schire, he won't have to spend any extra money. Don't bring any ambulance out. Just get 3 garbage cans. And when we're through with those 2 Mexicans and that Gentleman Jim Haiti, they can stuff them in a garbage can and put the lid on it and carry them out. I got about enough from you.
This next clip you're about to hear is in reference to the June 25th, 1966 match at the Cow Palace, Patterson and Stevens versus Cyclone Negro and Kenji Shibuya Now, this match would end up being ruled a draw when referee Tom Rice halted the match because Shibuya and Patterson were bleeding too badly in the third fall, and as you'll hear in this clip, it sets up a rematch for July 16th, 1966, with no stopping of the match due to blood.
Walt Harris back at ringside. I must admit, I've never looked forward to talking to you two before, but after talking to Ciclón Negro and Kenji Shibuya last week, I'm happy that you are here tonight, so I can ask you, did you deliberately go in that ring and split Shibuya's head open to save your partner and your title?
Well, if you really want to know the truth, I did. Just like that. You know, actually before this match, Pat and I made a big mistake because we actually underestimated these two guys. Not as wrestlers, or not as being rough, but we didn't figure that they could stick together and that they would think together like they did. So, actually, when we went in there to Cow Palace, when we were going to try a different type of strategy with them, and I don't mind saying it just didn't work because they didn't wrestle the way that we figured they would. We underestimated them. They wasn't only real rough wrestling, but they were thinking real good in there at the same time.
You mean you were not as rough this time as you usually wrestle? I thought it was a pretty rough bout from where I sat.
Well, it was rough, but we didn't wrestle as rough as we usually do because we didn't figure that we had to. And like I said, we were trying to change our strategy and befuddle these guys, but it just didn't work with them.
How about your partner, Pat Patterson? How was the cut? I mean, could you have continued?
Well, I'm going to say one thing. I was getting kind of weak when I got hit on the post because I was bleeding quite a bit. But I'm going to tell you one thing. As soon as I start to realize that I was bleeding a lot, and I saw Ray and there getting Shibuya revenge, well, I wanted to come in that ring and continue until I couldn't walk, until I couldn't move. I wanted to keep wrestling. I wanted to beat these guys so much, but that stupid referee stopped and stepped in between and stopped the match. Well, I just hope one thing, that the next match, I don't know who's going to referee the match, but I hope we don't have a referee with a weak stomach because there's going to be blood flying all over the place. I don't care if it's my blood, and I'm sure Ray doesn't care if it's his blood, but there's going to be blood in that match. Believe me, sir, there's going to be a lot of blood, and Ray and I is going to come out winner.
Well, I tell you, Shibuya told me last week that if you hadn't jumped it from behind, you wouldn't be able to split his head open on the post, and I thought you did not jump it from behind. I hate to agree with you. I mean, it's very seldom that we do, but in this kind of a bout, it
doesn't make any difference to me whether you or anybody else agrees with me, because you saw what happened. When I went out of the ring here, I jumped out to look at Pat's head, and I knew that he was cut too bad, and the referee would stop the match. If he stopped the match, that meant that these two guys would get the title. And I couldn't see the title going either back to Japan or to Mexico with Negro, or going to Japan with Shibuya. So after they got him cut, they knew they had the match won on a technicality. They knew that the referee would have to stop it. So then I quit trying to use real good wrestling on these guys, and I started using my head. So I went in and I cut Shibuya, hoping that if he was cut too, that the referee would stop the match and we just have to settle for a draw. That's second best. I don't like to settle for second best.
Well, now, you're not going to underestimate him in this one, Saturday, July 16th, and as we've said before, this will not be stopped for blood, so you're going to wrestle what way against him?
Listen, we are going to wrestle rougher than you have ever seen us wrestle in our lives. And we're going to I'll tell everybody, and I hope they're watching. We're going to break every rule in the book that we can, right from the very start until the finish. And like Pat said, there's going to be a lot of blood flowing around there, and it's not going to be my blood, and it's not going to be Pat's blood. It's going to be their blood flowing all over that arena when we get through with them.
Well, I know that's the way they feel about you, too. They were crying all over the place last week and saying what they were going to do to you, so I guess, boy, this is it. Saturday, July 16th, the Pier 6 Brawl from beginning to end. No holds barred.
The Alliance, they asked us to wrestle these guys. They said that we'd probably be forced to wrestle them anyhow. They didn't have to force us because we wanted to get them back in the ring. Under any circumstances, we wanted to get them back in there because it only cost us a lot of money, hurt our pride, hurt our standing all over the world, what these two guys done to us.
Because it was a draw.
That's exactly right. The next time we get them in there, they're going to end up in the hospital up here. We won't let the title go back to Japan or to Mexico because, as you know, the best wrestlers come to the United States, and that's why Ray and I are the World Tag Team Champions, because we're both in the United States, and we're going to keep the title in the United States. We're going to travel all around the world, but there'll be 2 United States guys that have the title.
Not good enough. Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson against Seacon Negro and Kenji Shibuya at the Cow Palace Saturday, July 16th.
The next audio segment you're about to hear are Patterson and Stevens talking about a Cow Palace match versus Murder Inc., the feud with Cyclone Negro and Kenji Shibuya, as well as an attack by Negro and Shibuya. Let's go to this.
Harris once again. Well, tomorrow night at the Cow Palace, that is the big one. Cowboy Billy Watts against Gorilla Monsoon, one fall to a finish for the United States Heavyweight Championship. Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson against Murder Incorporated, Kenji Shibuya and Seacon Negro, in a bout that will not be stopped for blood with the World's Tag Team Championship at stake. Stevens and Patterson, congratulations on winning that bout. It's a tough one here tonight, but you guys are really moving at the finish.
Well, I hope that Seacon Negro and Shibuya was watching, because we just wanted to show them that we can wrestle scientific as well as we can wrestle rough, too.
You need actually all kinds of wrestling in order to beat a team like Shibuya Negro, but in the last bout you had with him, which was stopped on account of blood when Patterson had his head split open, I was quite surprised that it was a draw, because you had actually asked for that bout, being sure that you could beat that team.
Well, it's like I told you before, we actually underestimated that team, which was very bad on our part. We usually never make a mistake like that, but we just underestimated them, and it ended up, it was a draw. So it was our fault. But this next match coming up, where no matter who gets cut or how bad anybody's bleeding or anything else, they're not going to stop it. This is our kind of wrestling. This is the kind of wrestling that we really and truly enjoy, because it's not going to be just like a wrestling match. It's going to be like a back alley brawl, like in some dark street someplace, and this is what we like.
Well, we know how rough and tough you and Patterson are, but this Negro and Shibuya, I mean, they're really, they're a couple of animals actually in that ring, and you talk about that kind of wrestling, and that's up their alley, actually.
Listen, we're going to kick their teeth out before they even get started when they get in that ring. We're going to run down to the ring as fast as we can and try to beat them down there to the ring, so that when they stick their ugly faces through these ropes at the Cow Palace, they're going to get our shoes right between their lips, because we're going to try to kick their teeth out as soon as the bell rings.
Well, you better be first, because they're probably listening to this, and when they heard you say that, they're going to say they'll be first into the ring.
Well, I hope they're listening to it. It doesn't really make any difference if we don't beat them. We're not first in the ring. Well, we'll be the last to come out of the ring. I'll guarantee you that, because they'll be carrying these two birds out when we get through with them. Well, tomorrow night you're going to see a wolf. I'm going to be a wolf tomorrow night. I'm going to be after that Shibuya, because he cut my head open. I cut his head open also. But tomorrow I'm going to break all the bones he's got on his body. And believe me, I'm going to send him to the hospital. I just want to get my hand on Shibuya. He won't do that to me anymore. Let me tell you. Tomorrow night I'll be there like a madman. You want to wrestle like a madman? Well, I'll be there like a crazy man. Get to the fact on that Shibuya. I hope he does break some of his arms, both of his arms and both of his legs. I think you'll have a hard time getting through that big. Well, I hope that Shibuya can hear me right now. Listen, Shibuya, I'm going to send you right back to Japan, and you won't be able to come back here anymore, because I'm going to bust your head open so much. I'm going to bring that to the right way. You go ahead. I want to talk to him. Listen to me, Shibuya. Listen, tomorrow night
Partner wants you to go, Pat.
Never mind, Ray. I want to tell you right in your face, Shibuya. Tomorrow night I'm going to bring myself a bucket for your blood. I'm going to send you right back to Japan. I'll tell you right in your face.
Patterson kicked in the back of the head here by Negro. His head slammed into the iron post by Shibuya. Shibuya has him again. Slammed his head in there again. Patterson is raging mad, but he's down here on the cement right now. Negro kicked him in the back of the head. Then Shibuya grabbed him around his head into the steel post here. Not once, but twice. Patterson was so mad, and talking to Shibuya, he neglected to keep an eye on Negro. That certainly is that kind of a team. That was a disgraceful thing to do here, and I can imagine they'll be fine for intermission. Hey, Stevens is out here. Stevens is out here. Stevens is out here now. Patterson's still down here on the cement. Stevens is up there. The referee's trying to keep him back. This is not a scheduled spot. They cannot wrestle. They could be fine here. Well, Negro and Shibuya baiting them on. They want Stevens to put in there. The Negro, get him out of here. That Shibuya and Negro just baiting him on. They'd love to get him in there 2-on-1. Patterson is in real rocky shape down here. And Stevens now helping Patterson out of the studio. Patterson in real bad shape. It's then slammed into the steel post twice here by Shibuya after he's kicked in the back of the head by Negro. This team had no business being out here because we had other things coming up so that we would have plenty of time between the two bouts. We'll be back here with this bout, but right now we're going to pause for station identification.
Our next clip, our final clip from 1966, is referencing a Cow Palace match on August 13th, 1966. Patterson and Stevens, along with Haystacks Calhoun, versus Cyclone Negro, Kenji Shibuya, and Gorilla Monsoon.
We're going to talk to the world's tag team champion now. You must be a little surprised to hear this applause, Mr. Patterson.
Well, we are a little surprised. We really don't care about the applause and everything. But I'm going to tell you, we are so ready for Kenji Shibuya and Cyclone Negro and Gorilla Monsoon that I can't wait to get in the ring with them because we have a big surprise for these three baboon, I would call them. Let me tell you.
No, who is he?
Well, never mind. Never mind. Listen, we done a lot of negotiating. We made a lot of phone calls. And finally, we traveled 6,000 miles to get a hold of the man that we wanted to wrestle as our partner.
People have been waiting here for over a week to find out who the third man is going to be in your team, so you might as well tell them now.
All right, wait just a minute, and I'll tell you, and I'll tell everybody else. But first, I want to tell you why that we went through all this trouble and did all the traveling to get the person that we got to be our team partner. First of all, this Shibuya Negro, they're out to cripple Patterson and I. First of all, this is why they got Monsoon and this big mouth Red Berry. They figured if they got this big guy that they would cripple us. Although this is not a title match, they'd cripple us and they'd get us completely out of the wrestling business, and then our title would be vacated and they'd just step in and take over. And that'd be simple for them. Now, this is what they had in the back of their mind.
Is that why you spent money to go 6,000 miles just to sign a wrestler as a third man?
That's exactly right. When I get in there with those three guys, and knowing that these two guys are going to be trying to cripple us to start with, I wanted to get me a real good insurance policy. So therefore, I spent a lot of money and a lot of time, and we done a lot of traveling, and I think that we got us a real good insurance policy.
Tell them who your insurance policy is, or I'm going to tell them.
Well, wait just a minute, and I'll tell you. I talked to this man. It took us 3 days talking to him and negotiating with him to get him to finally wrestle with us, but he agreed, and I didn't only get the biggest wrestler there is, but I think I got one of the toughest wrestlers in the wrestling business, and he's bigger than Monsoon. We got Haystack Calhoun to be our partner. That's the one, and I just can't wait. August the 13th on the Cow Palace. I just can't forget the date because I just can't wait to get in that ring to surprise Shibuya and Negro. Believe me, and even that Monsoon will be running away from Haystack Calhoun. So many times I've heard this big mouth Red Berry say that he's got the biggest and the toughest wrestler in the wrestling business who goes around crippling people. Well, do you know how much that Haystack Calhoun weighs?
I know how much.
He weighs 601 pounds, and I think that's a couple pounds heavier than this Monsoon.
You know, you two could hide behind Haystack Calhoun against that team.
Well, I'll tell you, him and I have got something to settle with this Shibuya and Negro. And we got Calhoun in there to take care of Monsoon. Anytime a Monsoon comes to the ring, we're just going to leave him completely to Haystack. And we're going to be after Shibuya and Negro. Now, these guys were going to try and cripple us. Well, this is exactly what we're going to try to do to them.
Well, I think I know why you traveled 6,000 miles to sign such a man then. Haystack, this is going to be a little bit of a surprise to Wild Red Berry. Someone bigger than his man.
Well, it'll probably be a surprise to him. I don't know what he'll think, and I don't care. But, you know, he thinks that he's so smart, and he's got so many tricks he's going to use. But he's going to learn if he messes around with Stevens and Patterson. He's going to think that he was wrestling Houdini when he was in there. There's one thing we're going to be looking for. I just hope, and I know that it will happen because we'll do our best to have Haystack give a big splash to that big baboon Monsoon. And believe me, Monsoon's going to look like a midget compared to Haystack.
Our next series of clips are from 1969, where things have drastically changed for the Blonde Bombers. This first clip aired on July 5th, 1969. It is Pat Patterson talking about his July 12th, 1969 match at the Cow Palace against Ray Stevens. Let's go to this.
Remember, next Saturday, July 12th, is the big one at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. Let's check your mask now. I suppose it's all right. Nothing in my mask. I just beat that guy fair and square. He was no man for me. That's how I beat him so easy. Well, why did you run right out of here when the bout was over then? Listen, I didn't run out of here. I went out there to get my pictures right here. I don't have nothing to hide. But the reason why I wear this mask is because I'm a nice-looking guy, and I wouldn't want to be like the other guys, like Ray Stevens or Big Bill Miller and all these guys, become ugly and have my face all busted out. The reason why I wear this mask is to protect my face. And besides that, this mask is a good luck charm to me. You're so handsome, you can't afford... Well, I still say you brought that towel out here deliberately to get farmers' attention tonight. You had that object in your trunks tonight. Listen, I don't have nothing in my trunks. Would you like to see what I've got in my trunks? I bet I can show that on television. But I'll tell you one thing. I got something to show you right here. That's one thing that keeps reminding me that what Ray Stevens did to me. Now, come on, cameraman. We don't want to look at your pictures. Never mind. Come here, stupid. Take a close-up of this here. Oh, there's me, Pat Patterson, right here. 3 months sitting down with a broken leg. Here is another picture. And here is another picture. And here is another picture. I have these pictures all over my house. I have one in the closet. I have one in the bathroom. I have one in the bedroom. I have one in my car. I have one in my suitcase. Because for the simple reason, I cannot forget for what Ray Stevens did to me. And believe you me, I'm not proud to show these pictures on television, but I want you stupid people to see it. Because I want you to see one thing. This face you see right here is me. But after July the 12th, you're going to see the same picture, but it's going to be Ray Stevens' face over there. I'll guarantee you one thing. That's one thing I'm going to do. I don't care about the title. I don't care about the title. All I want to do is cripple Ray Stevens, and believe you me, I'm going to do it. Well, there'll be thousands of people out there that'll think you can't do the job. They'll think that Stevens can beat you like he's beaten all the other challengers. Let me tell you something. Ray Stevens won the match last time against Big Bill Miller. He didn't beat Big Bill Miller. Rocky Marciano hit Big Bill Miller, and Big Miller went lay down on the cement floor. Now, what kind of a champion is he? All you people, you think that Ray Stevens is such a nice guy. Well, let me tell you something. Ray Stevens, when he goes to New York, or when he goes to wrestle in Chicago, he tried the same bit as he tried over here before. He went to Chicago and he says, well, now that I came back from Japan, I want to be a nice guy. But those people in Chicago and those people in New York, they're smart people. They still boo Ray Stevens. They know he's a big phony. But over here, everybody cheers Ray Stevens. You know why? Because the people around here in the Bay Area are a bunch of idiots. That's the kind of people that I have around here. They don't know a good wrestler from a bad one. You people are too stupid to realize what kind of guy Ray Stevens is. Well, I know what kind of guy he is because I was with him for 3 years. And one thing Ray Stevens knows, he knows that there is one man that can beat him. I can do it. And I'll guarantee you one thing, my friend, that as soon as that bell rings July the 12th, that's one date I can't wait to come. As soon as that bell rings, I'm gonna knock Ray Stevens flat on his back. And all of you out there, you love Ray Stevens, don't you? You love him. You want part of him, don't you? Well, after I knock him out on his back, I'll grab his leg and I'll twist him and I'll rip it apart and I'll throw the legs and the arm back to you. You can have part of Ray Stevens because after this, I'm going to be the new champion and Ray Stevens going to be in the hospital with a broken leg, with a broken arm, and with a broken neck. You'll do all this without your mask, I imagine. I'll wear my mask. I'll wear my mask from the dressing room to the ring. And like I said, I'll do worse to Ray Stevens than what I've been doing to all these guys around here.
That's all I got to say to you, and all I want to do is stay of the July 12th because I'm going to cripple the men that I always want to do it. Well, he's got to take your pictures. We don't want your pictures. Take these, too. We don't want them. Not with me because I just might break one of your legs. You haven't got your mask on now. Right now, I stand right here, and when I think of Ray Stevens, and when I look at those pictures, my leg hurts right now when I think of it. And if you get smart with me, I just might break one of your legs right now. You put on your mask first, won't you? I will do that.
Coming out of that match that they had at the Cow Palace on July 12th, a match where Ray Stevens defeated Pat Patterson 2 out of 3 falls via disqualification in the third fall. We have this interview airing on July 19th, 1969, the interview conducted by the legendary Dick Lane. Let's go to this.
Back here again, and I've agreed to speak with Pat Patterson.
Listen, what's the idea of having Chris Markup as the #1 challenger? I'm the #1 challenger right here. I'm the man that beat Ray Stevens fair and square right in the middle of the ring. I should be the #1 challenger, but I know why I'm the #1. Because Ray Stevens is scared of that. He went to the alliances and he said he didn't want a match with me because he's scared. Because he knows I beat him right in the middle of that ring.
Let me tell you something, Mr. Blabbermouth. You didn't beat Ray Stevens, and you've never lived long enough to meet the day you can beat Ray Stevens.
Listen, there was 14,000 people right here at the Cow Palace, and every one of you idiots out there, you saw me beat Ray Stevens right in the middle of the ring. Now the referee counted 1, 2, and 3, and I was the winner. I was the winner. I was the United States champion. I did what I said I was going to do.
You were the winner for 10 seconds.
Well,
Until Peter Maiva came down and found the piece that you put in your mask to beat Stevens in the head with. A foreign object. You had to arm yourself with something. You don't wear that.
I didn't have no foreign object. No. Listen, I've been telling you all you idiots out there how much I know Ray Stevens. I know all his tricks. Well, I must admit one thing. I knew that Ray Stevens was going to pull the mask out of my head because that's the kind of trick he likes to do. I know him very well. So I told Tom Andrew, I said, Tom, you stay and watch the match in case he does pull the mask over my head. Because without that good luck charm here, I cannot win. Listen to me. And he did pull that mask out of my head. That's why Tom Andrew came next to the ring and gave me an extra mask. And what did I do? I beat Ray Stevens right in the middle of the ring. The referee counted 1, 2, and 3. He raised my head. I was the United States champion. You hear that?
For 10 seconds only.
Listen.
Until they found out what a louse you are.
Listen.
What a louse you are.
I'm not a louse. Steven is a louse. I'll tell you one thing.
If you think you're a wrestler, you walk into the ring and arm yourself with a metal disc. The referee has it, turned it in, and you were disqualified. And Mr. Ray Stevens is still the United States Heavyweight Wrestling Champion and will continue to be.
Listen, you make me sick because you don't know anything. I know Ray Stevens, and I know what he did. He had Peter Maiva come next to that ring.
Yes, sir.
I know all his tricks. He had Peter Maiva come in that ring. When he knew he was beat, Peter Maiva jumped in the ring. And Tom Andrews told me after the match that Peter Maiva came in the ring and he already had something in his hand. And he attacked me from the back. He already had something. I didn't have nothing in my hand. I did not.
Cut it out.
Listen, and he attacked me from the back. He wouldn't have the guts to ask me to attack me by the front, but he attacked me in the back, and he made believe that he pulled something out of my back.
He did.
And he went to show it to the referee.
He gave it to the
Well, let me
referee.
tell you, I don't blame the referee for reversing the decision. But, listen, Peter Maiva came in the ring with a piece of steel in his hand.
He did not.
And he made believe he put it out of mask. I didn't have nothing in my mask. I didn't have nothing in my tank. I beat Ray Stevens right in the middle of the ring. I didn't need no piece of steel. I didn't need nothing. I just beat him fair and square. I should be the #1 challenger.
You know where you are now? You're down in number 20-something.
Don't say that because I'm going to kill you right here.
You're not going to kill
Listen,
anyone.
man.
You couldn't
Listen.
lips.
If I get a hold of that Ray Stevens, I don't care where. On that bus, on the plane in the alley. Listen, I came here in the studio tonight, and when Ray Stevens saw me come in, he ran like a scared bird up the stairs, and he went and hid. And every time he saw me around the corner, I'd look at him and he'd run all over the place. Because you know why? He knows I am mad, and he knows I want to kill him, and he is afraid. You just mark my words, because one day, I don't know when, but one day you will see and you will hear that Pat Patterson crippled up and beat up Ray Stevens somewhere in an alley.
Well, it could be right here.
I'm gonna do it.
Could be right here in the building. He'll be in this ring in a few minutes. You won't have to hunt anywhere for him.
Listen,
he'll be right in this
I'm
ring.
talking about him right now. If he was such a man, why doesn't he come out to my face? He's afraid. That's
Go
why.
get a reputation. You're number 28.
Listen, Ray Stevens knows I'm not afraid of nobody. And all of you out there, you don't scare me a bit. I'm not afraid of nobody. But I know one man that's afraid of me, and that's Ray Stevens. And believe you me, I'll get hold of him one of these days. You just mark my words.
Blab, 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 blab. Well, it won't be until you go back and work yourself back up to a position of challenger. Right now, he is not the challenger. The principal challenger for the United States Heavyweight Championship is Chris Markle. You'll see him on the 9th of August at the Cow Palace, but not Mr. Pat Patterson.
This next interview, also with Dick Lane, aired on July 26, 1969, right after Pat Patterson defeated Bobby Shane. It is regarding the August 9th, 1969 Cow Palace match against Ray Stevens. Now, famously, Ray Stevens would end up getting injured out of the ring and would be replaced on this show by Pedro Morales. But here is Pat Patterson talking about Ray Stevens.
We're back here again to talk with Mr. Patterson. I'm not happy about that. He's kicking again at the head. He had to go back in the ring and kick away at young Bobby Shane.
Come on, just say what you gotta say before I came over. Because I heard what you said when you were talking to Ray Stevens.
Before you open your big mouth, let me tell you something. I'm going to get you told once. You are probably the foulest, most obviously crooked man I've ever seen in the ring. And I've seen some luck in my time.
I said I don't care what you say, and I don't care what these idiots says. I don't care at all. The one thing that I don't like, I heard you tell Ray Stevens that you hope that he cripples me.
I do.
Listen, what side are you on? You should be on this side.
Not on your side.
I think where you should be where you belong, in a garbage can. That's where you should be.
You'll never be arrested for being against a character like you, I can tell you that.
Listen, it takes a man to be like me, and that's why August the 9th, I'm going to be the United States champion. That's exactly why.
You keep saying that, and you've made believe it someday, but you have to prove it. Now, you've got yourself a fine, and you've got a suspension, and you owe a vote of thanks to Ray Stevens for getting your suspension lifted to a point where you can get back in the ring. You're going to lose $1,500. You know that, don't you?
Listen, I must say one thing. I must thank Ray Stevens, all right?
Yeah.
And just to prove you how stupid he is, I was supposed to be suspended 90 days and fined $500. Well, Ray Stevens didn't want me to be suspended, so they fined me $1,500 instead. And he wants me back in the ring. Well, that's what I want, you see? That's what I want. I want him in the ring, too, because I want to prove to all of you idiots out there that I can beat Ray Stevens and I can be the United States champion.
time at the Cow Palace, who had their brains beaten out? It was Ray Stevens. Last week, right here, who had his brains beaten out? It was Ray Stevens, wasn't it? It wasn't me. And the last time at the Cow Palace, who was declared the winner? Who was declared the champion? It was me right here, Pat Patterson. I was the United States champion. Until 3 minutes. Until Peter Maiva found and turned over to the referee that steel disc that you put in your helmet and beat. Oh, listen, as you know, and all of you idiots out there, you all know that I didn't have nothing in my mask. I don't have anything in my mask or in my face. I just have a hard head. Well, why do you wear it? Peter Maiva came in that ring, and he already had something in his hand. And he attacked you from the back, and he showed the referee a piece of steel that he already had in his hand. Oh, come on. And they stripped me from the title because the referee called it. And I was the United States champion. But the referee disqualified me. Well, I'll tell you something else. On Saturday night, the 9th of August, you're going to go into that ring, and you'll get another shot at that title, which you do not deserve. You haven't earned that title. You dropped down to 22 in the ratings. You don't know what you're talking about, think I don't? Who is going against Ray Stevens, August the 9th, the #1 challenger? Chris Markup, they have no right to be in there. I am the #1 challenger, and I should be the United States champion right now at this minute. I should be the champion right now. You're not going to be. You know one thing that makes me laugh? It really does tickle me. Ray Stevens came out here with a little box. Yeah. That's the biggest show that I had ever seen. Listen, Ray Stevens got all kinds of tricks, and he's got a trick in that little box of his. Listen, I've got a lot more tricks than you've ever known. So he's not scaring me at all. And he says that he can. Lose the match with what he's going to use in that little box. I would like to know what he's got in that little box. I bet you'd like to give another $1,500 to find out what's in that box. You bet I would, but first of all, I want one thing. I want Ray Stevens at the Cow Palace in the championship match. And all of you idiots out there, I've been telling you for years that I am better than Ray Stevens. I am faster than Ray Stevens. And I should be the United States champion. And I will be, because this time at the Cow Palace, I'm going to get rid of Ray Stevens because now you just mark my word. I've done it twice before. Now last week with the promoter and all these guys wouldn't have stopped me. I would have gave Ray Stevens the worst concussion that you've ever had. But this time at the Cow Palace, there'll be nobody to stop me. And Ray Stevens will be out of wrestling champion. I'll guarantee you that. Well, your guarantee is not worth the paper it's written on or the voice it took to make it.
Our next interview aired on August 2nd, 1969. Once again, talking about the big match on August 9th, 1969 against Ray Stevens at the Cow Palace.
Saturday night, August the 9th at the Cow Palace, the United States Heavyweight Championship at stake. Ray Stevens defending against this man, Pat Patterson. I should be the United States champion because the last time at the Cow Palace, I did beat Ray Stevens right in the middle of the ring, and the referee called 1, 2, and 3. I should be the champion, not him. And we also know how you won before the referee found out and took the bout away from you. I'm surprised you didn't use it here tonight. Listen, I don't use nothing in my diet or in my mask. You know better than that. And all of you, you all know better than that. Every time I see you later, you're using something in your mask. Listen, don't worry about the mask. What I worry about right now is this. I signed the contract to wrestle Ray Stevens. And on the contract, there was nothing about any buck. Now Ray Stevens comes over here, and he has a buck, and he has something in that buck. And I don't know what it is, but I know one thing. He's not supposed to use anything. Ray Stevens is not supposed to use anything. But some mushnick told me, he says, you using a mask, Ray Stevens can use anything he wants. Well, I don't think it's fair. Well, you know, Sam Mushnick is a man that doesn't say his mind. But, like I said, I am smarter than Ray Stevens, so I went to the board of directors, and we had a big meeting. And they told me that they might stop Ray Stevens from using what's in that box. They might.
I know the board, and they do not overrule the president. He makes a decision, they stand behind him. They say when he says Stevens can use what's in that box, he can use it. Why are you afraid of it? I thought you were not afraid of anything.
I'm not going to wrestle Ray Stevens if he uses what's in that box. Now listen, he might have a hammer in there, or he might have a blackjack, or he might have a brass stuff. I don't know. You know, any man should not use any foreign object in that ring. Nobody's allowed to use it.
Why don't you leave your mask off when you wrestle then?
A mask is just like a pair of tights, and besides that, this mask is bringing me a lot of luck. Well, I'll tell you one thing. If Ray Stevens is going to use what's in that box, I'm not going to wrestle him because I don't think it's fair.
You're getting a little afraid of the man now. You know what he's going to do to you when he gets you in the ring.
Listen, I'm not afraid of Ray Stevens. I'm not afraid of nobody. And I want all of you out there to know that. I'm not afraid of any one of you. And Ray Stevens, well, I'm afraid of what he's got in that box. Like I said, he might have a piece of steel in there, or he might have a hammer or a blackjack. I don't think it's fair.
Well, you'll find out next Saturday night at the Cow Palace what he's got in there.
Well, let me tell you something. Next Saturday night at the Cow Palace, no matter what he's going to use in that box, listen, I know I'm worried about it, and I would like to find out what he's got in that box. But I'll make sure, because one thing I'm going to do is as soon as Ray Stevens gets in that ring, I'm going to make sure that he doesn't have enough time to use what he's going to have in that box.
Okay, next Saturday, get back to
And I'm going to be the new champion. I've been trying to tell all of you people that I am better than Ray Stevens. But you can't understand that, can you? You can't put it through your head, can you? Why don't you listen to me when I'm telling you? I am better than Ray Stevens.
listen to you enough. Next Saturday night, August the 9th, the Cow Palace in San Francisco, Stevens and Patterson for the United States Heavyweight Championship.
This next clip is from August 9th, 1969, the day of the Cow Palace show, and word is now coming out that Ray Stevens is injured, and here's Pat Patterson's reaction to that news.
Get out and see him. Pat Barrett will be on the card. That's great.
What's the idea? I don't care what you say. What's the idea of announcing that Ray Stevens might not be able to wrestle tonight? Listen, Ray Stevens signed a contract to wrestle me at the Cow Palace, and he has to be there.
Well, the doctors will decide that tonight when they examine it to see how the cuts are.
Listen, I don't care what a doctor has to say. I know what Ray Stevens is trying to do. He's trying to run away from me because he is yellow and he's scared. Now, I saw Ray Stevens. All he's got is a few stitches on his head, and he's trying to run away from me. I wrestled before with 36 stitches in my head, and I went on in that ring. I wasn't afraid. I know he's yellow, and he's trying to get away from that mask. That's what he's trying to do.
I'm not afraid of you because he's got that box and he's got something in it that will equalize whatever you put in your mask. So he's not the least bit afraid of you tonight.
Listen, I was afraid of what he had in that box a few weeks ago, but I'm not afraid anymore. Because what he had in that box, don't scare me. If it was that great, you think he'd back away from me? Ray Stevens is not hurt more than anybody, but he's just yellow, and he's trying to get away from me in that mask. But I'm going to tell you something, and all of you something, that you don't know, and that the promoter doesn't know. I talked to Sam Mushnick, and if Ray Stevens does not wrestle tomorrow night, he is going to lose the title. They're going to take the title away from him. Now, the last time I wrestled Ray Stevens, I got cheated by the referee because Peter Maiva jumped in the ring. And this time, Ray Stevens tried to run away from me and take the title away from me again. Well, that's not fair. I want him to be there because I want to beat him. And this
for 2 years as world tag team champs. You know he'll be there tonight.
Listen, I've been with Ray Stevens for a long time, and I realize one thing right now, that Ray Stevens and I have one thing in common.
What's that?
Well, listen, if I was Ray Stevens, I wouldn't want to wrestle Pat Patterson either. I wouldn't want to wrestle myself, because Pat Patterson is the toughest and the meanest wrestler that you have ever seen, and I will be the new United States champion. You just go. I don't care what you say. He's just throwing you away. He's a yellow. He's so good.
A commercial
He's not
message
even
is
hurt.
back here.
You're gonna tell me he's got some
Take it away.
He's not even hurt.
Our next clip is from August 16th, 1969. It is the first interview Pat Patterson has done since winning the U.S. title via forfeit at the Cow Palace, talking about his big defense on September 13th against Bobo Brazil.
Walt Harris back at ringside. We have with us the new United States Heavyweight Wrestling Champion, and I don't know how a man like you can have the luck that you've had this past weekend. You win the title from Stevens on a forfeit. You're lucky when you beat Morales by barely beating the count when he had you beat. How can one man be so lucky and still be like you?
Listen, I'm not lucky. The only thing is because I'm a great wrestler. Now, as you know, I am now the United States champion. So from now on, you can call me Mr. Patterson, and that goes for all of you out there. From now on, you call me Mr. Pat Patterson, because I am now the United States champion. One thing I want to tell you. Now, as you know, I am the champion. And Morales, I could have covered him, I could have beat him, and after he was down, laid down on the mat there, I could have crippled him real bad. But as you know, I am now the champion, and I represent everybody in the United States, so I have to be a nice guy. So all I had to do, when the referee was counting to 10, I got up just on time to win the match. That's all I had to do.
You barely got up. Morales had you beat, but enough about
No,
that.
I didn't barely get up. I knew what the referee was doing. But like I said, I was trying to be a nice guy because I'm not a champion. And I didn't have to beat Morales. All I had to do was get up.
Look, you were lucky you got the title from Stevens. You're lucky you beat Morales, and now you're acting like you don't need your good luck charm. I think you better keep that handy. Without that, you would never had a chance at the title.
Listen, you were holding it. It was close to the ring. That's all I needed. And as far as Ray Stevens is concerned, listen, I would love any time to meet Ray Stevens anywhere. And I just can't wait for the day to meet Ray Stevens, because I am not afraid of him. And I know that Ray Stevens can't beat me. I just know.
I think
so. Anytime Mr. Stevens is ready, I'll be right in that ring, and I'll put up my title anytime. Just to show him that I'm not afraid of him.
I don't think you better worry about Ray Stevens right now. We don't know when he'll be back wrestling. But we do know this. You could have the shortest reign in the history of wrestling with that title, because on September 13th, you're going to meet the #1 challenger for your championship. And that man is not going to worry about your mask, because that man is Bobo Brazil with a big cocoa butt of his own. You better worry about Bobo.
Let me tell you something. I have a hard head, and like I said, I'm tired of having everybody telling me I use a foreign object. As you know, I've never cheated. I'm not a cheater, and I've never used a foreign object. I just have a hard head, and the reason why I wear this mask is to protect my face, and it's a good luck charm. As far as Bobo Brazil is concerned, he's got a hard head, all right, but he's got nothing in it. And that's why I know, and I'm not afraid, because I know I have a lot more brain than he has, because he's nothing but a big idiot, that's all he is.
Well, you'll find out on the 13th. That's all the time we got for you, even though you are the
That's
champion.
all the time we have. I'm not complaining, and I'm not afraid of Bobo Brazil. You didn't see me complain, did you?
No, you didn't complain.
Well, that's because I'm not afraid of him. Like I said, Bobo Brazil, he might be twice as big as I am, but it doesn't scare me. The muscle doesn't scare Patterson. That's what counts, the brain, and that's what I have.
Well, you got a lot of brains.
I certainly do. And I'd like to say one thing. I'm going to be a real good champion, and I'm going to be a better champion than Ray Stevens ever been a champion. As you know, Ray Stevens held the title about 5 or 6 times. And in all that period of time put together,
we've had enough of you. You keep your brains warm. You're going to need
let me do the talking. I've
done enough talking.
From September 13th, 1969, after the match with Bobo Brazil, here is the post-match interview, as well as a confrontation with Bobo.
Here comes the United States champion. You can hear the greeting as he comes into the studio.
I'm the setup because I'm the champion, and everybody should listen to me.
I'd like to ask you a question. How come this man hurt his fist when he hit you in the head?
Well, that's exactly what I want to tell you, boy. Listen, there's been a couple of rumors that me, the United States champion, use a foreign object in my mask. And you know, and everybody out here knows, that I don't have to use any foreign object in my mask to beat anybody. And I'd like to prove it to you and to prove it to everybody out here and in here that I don't use nothing in my mask. And I'll show you right now, right here. There is absolutely nothing in my mask. And you can look in here. I don't have nothing in my mask. And I just prove it to you. So don't call me a liar. And all of you out there, don't call me a liar anymore. Because I am a perfect champion. And I don't need any foreign object to beat anybody.
Why did you let the referee check your mask instead of scooting out of here? Coming back showing it to us now means absolutely nothing.
The referee doesn't have anything to do. The referee raised my hand. I won the match. All I want to do is get out of here. Get this man out of here. Get out of here. You don't belong in here. Get out of here before I kick you out of here.
Pat, you're playing hollering, screaming. But you don't use something in your mask. I watched you every time you wrestle. I know you have something in your mask. Now, why don't you prove to the people how tough you are? Put your little gimmick in there and hit me. Come on. There you are. Put your mask on, put whatever you got in it, and see what happens.
Listen, get this guy out of here. And I just told you I don't use anything in my mask. Just get this guy out of here. He doesn't belong in here. Now, he's not a gentleman. I didn't
Get back in the studio. You'll be walking out of the studio. Please. Pat, will you please step there 1 second? You didn't have enough guts to come out on mine of you, so I thought I would come out on yours. I want all these fans to see how chicken you are. Put your mask on. Put it on, please.
Listen, I don't have to put my mask on. You don't belong in here. Now get this guy out of here. Get him out of here.
Bobo, this man's obviously scared of you, and you can't touch him in here because if you did, you'd probably be fined or suspended. You know the rules of wrestling. Well, I like to hear Pat scream and holler. He's a good talker when he's talking to you.
Let me tell you something. I'm the champion, and I'm a perfect gentleman. Now, I didn't come into the head of you. That's my head of you. It just goes to show you you're nothing but a dropout. You're nothing but a big idiot. You might have a hard head, but you don't have nothing in it. And furthermore, I should have to get near you. But because I'm the champion, that's the thing I have to face. I don't even want to touch you.
You can't lay a hand on him here, Bobo. I know you'd like to, but you can't lay a hand on him. You can't take a chance here now.
And you know, I would like to put my hand on this man, but I don't want to get suspended and I don't want to get fined now. I don't mind the fine, but I don't want to get suspended because tonight I want to teach Mr. Patterson a few things. Now,
Mr. Patterson, one time and for all. I'll promise you that. Good enough, Bobo. We appreciate you coming on and challenging us. You're lucky the man won't take you on right now, but he will tonight.
Let me tell you something. There's nothing that I love more than a big man, a big idiot, come right here in front of millions of people and actually cry. You know why? Because he's afraid. He's nothing but a big dropout. He's never been anywhere. He's
got enough of you. He's not afraid.
Perfect champion.
He's a smart.
Now, he wanted me to headbutt him here, right?
Right.
No, the champion is too smart for that. But you just wait tonight. Tonight is going to be the night. Tonight is going to find out that my head is harder than his head.
With nothing in it, too, huh?
I'll prove it to you, and I'll prove it to him, and I'll prove it to you, you idiot, also.
A lot braver than Bobo isn't here. Pat Patterson and Bobo Brazil. Patterson never accepting the challenge. He's still on the lead. He wants to make sure Bobo Brazil's not out there blocking his way out of the studio.
And finally, here is Pat Patterson talking about the October 11th, 1969 match, a rematch with Bobo Brazil, this time, no disqualification.
Paul Harris back at ringside. We're going to talk to the United States heavyweight champion here for a moment. Pat Patterson.
Well, listen, that's ridiculous. I am the United States champion, and all these people out here are out here to boo me. Now, that's not right. It just goes to show you how stupid they are.
Maybe you should act like a champion and they might cheer you, but you don't know how to act like a champion. And it's interesting to note that you finally got caught with that thing you put in your mask.
Just a minute. First of all, I think it's ridiculous to have a return match with Bobo Brazil. Now, I beat Bobo Brazil, and I shouldn't have to wrestle him again.
Well, you didn't beat him. You were disqualified. He won the match. You just couldn't win the title on a disqualification.
I'm still the champion, am I? So I beat Bobo Brazil. And I'll tell you one thing. I talked to Sam Mushnick over the phone, and I told him how stupid it was to have me in a return match with Bobo Brazil with no disqualification. That's ridiculous. Can you imagine what this guy could do against me? Well, I'll tell you one thing. Now, he came here and he said that I put something in my mask. Now, you know, and all of you out there know, that I don't put nothing in my mask.
That last match at the Cow Palace, Bobo Brazil took it out of your mask and the referee saw it, and that's why you were disqualified. Bobo had it right in his hand to show to the referee.
Listen, Four Eyes, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you and all of you out there how wrong you are. Because you see, people like you and all of you out there, you all think that I put something in my mask, but I don't. You see what happened? Bobo Brazil, he made the big mistake. Just to show you how stupid he is, and so was the referee. Now, Bobo Brazil had butted me 2 times, and then he realized that he could not knock me out. Why? Because my head is just as hard as his head. And he realized that he could not headbutt me. Then he got panicky. He got nervous. The referee did not see that, but I did. And all of you out there, you saw it too. Bobo Brazil reached in his tights, and he beat me with it. Then he put his hand into my mask and made believe that he pulled that thing out of my mask. You see?
You mean he carried it into the ring because he needed it?
That's right. He had that thing in his tights.
And we're supposed to believe that story.
That's the true story. And you see, when the referee saw that Bobo had a foreign object in his hand, the referee yanked it out of his hand and disqualified me. So that cost him the title. Why? Because they're too stupid, that's why. And so is the referee.
I noticed he beat you and pinned you after it was over there.
Well, listen, you call that fair and square. When the referee rang the bell to disqualify me, I was trying to tell the referee that the foreign object did not come out of my mask, that it came out of Bobo Brazil's talking to the referee. Bobo Brazil attacked me from the back and then beat me. Now you call that a man? No, I don't. But I am a man, and this time there is no disqualification. Look, I've heard your story, and I'll tell you the truth. You carried that into the ring for two reasons. You wanted insurance. You needed it to beat Bobo Brazil. If not, you needed to get disqualified so you could keep your title. That's the reason you had it. That's what you think, but you know that's not the truth, and you all know. But this time, listen, this is no disqualification. Everything goes, and I know one thing, and you know that too, that I can beat Bobo Brazil, because in a no disqualification match, everything goes. I can grab a chair, I can break, I can grab anything. And furthermore, my sister can beat his sister, my dog can beat his dog, and my car can beat his car, and I can beat Bobo Brazil anytime. And furthermore, I'm so mad I can't even talk. I'm not gonna wear my mask that night. Good luck, Sean. You're not gonna take it to the ring? No, I don't need the mask to wear Bobo Brazil. And I'll beat him anytime, any place. And with a no disqualification, he's the one that's gonna pay the price. You keep looking over your shoulder like you're afraid he's here.
Once again, big thanks to Clay Puskas, and we are very grateful to be able to share Les Puskas' audio with you here today. Also, once again, big thanks to Jace Nacarado and Lou Kippelman for all their help in putting this episode together. We'll see you next time on the Super Podcast.